The wilderness holds secrets that even the most determined souls can't always uncover. But in the spring of 1857, as dawn broke over the rugged slopes of Eagle Ridge, a set of faint footprints told a story of desperation, courage, and survival against impossible odds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A mother with infant twins, fleeing from unimaginable horror. A skilled tracker caught between two worlds. Their paths would cross in a moment that would challenge everything they believed about trust, judgment, and the bonds that connect us beyond blood and tribe. The wagon creaked under Sarah Mitchell's nervous fingers as she adjusted the canvas covering, shielding her sleeping twins from the early spring chill. Emma and Ethan, barely a year old, their faces peaceful in slumber, unaware of the tension hanging in the air like morning mist. The wagon train had been traveling for 3 weeks, 15 families pushing west toward Pine Valley, toward promise and possibility. But something felt wrong today. "Ma'am, best keep those little ones quiet when we pass through the ravine," the wagon master warned, his eyes scanning the ridgelines. "Word is, there's been trouble ahead." Sarah nodded, throat tight. She'd made this journey alone. Her husband Thomas, 6 months in the ground from fever, leaving her with infant twins and a dream half finished. The other families were kind enough, but in her heart, she remained a stranger among them. A widow, with 2 babies, and no business crossing wild country alone. The ravine approached, narrow and deep, towering rock walls, casting long shadows across the trail. Sarah pulled the twins closer, hushing Emma's sudden cry with practiced hands. The wagon master's voice drifted back, something about hurrying, about danger, about... The first arrow struck with a sickening thud. Then came the war cries, the gunshots, the screams. "Run! Everyone, run!" The wagon master's last words before he fell. Sarah didn't think, didn't plan. She grabbed the twins, one under each arm, wrapped in their shared blanket, and slipped from the back of the wagon as chaos erupted around her. Blood-soaked earth, gun smoke, a woman's scream cut short. Sarah ran, stumbling up the rocky slope, away from the trail, away from the massacre unfolding behind her. She didn't look back, couldn't. The twins were silent against her chest, as if they understood that noise meant death. Her lungs burned, legs trembling as she climbed higher, farther, following a game trail that wound between towering pines and granite boulders. When she finally stopped, it was because her body simply refused to go further. The sounds of violence had faded, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the wind through the trees and her own ragged breathing. Emma began to whimper, and Sarah pressed her face close, whispering comfort through her own terror. "Hush now, my loves, hush." Night was coming. The spring air held winter's teeth after sundown in these mountains. Sarah's gaze caught on a dark shadow in the rock face, a narrow opening, barely visible between 2 boulders. A cave, perhaps. Shelter. Inside, the space opened enough for her to sit, the twins cradled against her. No fire. No light, no sound, just darkness and the steady heartbeats of her children against her own. "We'll wait," she whispered, rocking gently. "Just until morning. Then we'll find help." But morning brought the distant sound of horses and men's voices. Sarah peered from the cave entrance, catching glimpses of riders in the valley below. Not rescue, but those who had attacked, returning to scavenge what remained. She retreated deeper into the cave, feeding the twins cold water and the last of the bread she'd grabbed in her flight. Days passed. Her water ran low. The twins grew, fussy, hungry. Sarah chewed tough jerky strips into softness for them, rationed sips of water, sang hushed lullabies when they cried. She ventured out only at night, trembling with exhaustion, to gather rainwater in her cupped hands. twice she spotted campfires in the distance. Both times she retreated to the cave, uncertain whether those fires meant safety or further danger. On the seventh day, dizzy with hunger and fear, Sarah made a desperate choice. She would leave at dusk, follow the stream she'd found, hope it led to the settlement at Pine Valley. Better to risk the journey than watch her babies waste away in this stone prison. As evening shadows lengthened, she wrapped the twins tight against the chill and stepped from the cave. Her foot slipped on loose stone, sending a small cascade of pebbles down the slope. Not loud, but enough. Enough for skilled ears to hear. Enough to betray her position to the man who had been tracking her faint trail for 2 days. 100 yards below, James Walker froze at the sound. The Cherokee tracker raised his head, eyes narrowing as he scanned the rocky slope. For days, Colonel Hayes at Fort Harrison had pressed him to find survivors from the wagon train massacre. "Your people weren't responsible," Hayes had insisted. "But you're the only man who can track in these hills." James hadn't wanted this assignment. Caught between worlds, neither fully Cherokee nor accepted by the white settlements, he preferred the solitude of his cabin at the forest's edge. But he knew what would happen if he refused. Blame would fall on his mother's people, regardless of which tribe had actually attacked the wagons. So he tracked, following faint signs that others would miss. A disturbed stone, broken twigs, and, finally, impossibly, the partial print of a woman's boot pressed into mud near a stream. Not the heavy boot of a frontier woman, but something finer, Eastern-made. And beside it, something that made his heart tighten, tiny depressions, the size of a child's fingers in the soft earth. Someone had survived. A woman and a child, or perhaps two, given the different-sized markings he'd found. They were alive, at least as of yesterday. The sound of falling pebbles drew his attention upward. There, a shadow moved against stone. James stood motionless, letting his eyes adjust. Not the movement of an animal, too deliberate, too careful. "I know you're there," he called, his voice carrying in the evening stillness. "I'm not here to harm you." Silence. "The settlement sent me," he added, though it wasn't entirely true. "There was an attack on your wagon train. I'm looking for survivors." From above came a choked sound, half sob, half disbelief. "How do I know?" A woman's voice, ragged with exhaustion. "How do I know you're not with them?" James stepped into clearer view, deliberately moving away from his rifle, which rested against a tree. "My name is James Walker. I'm a tracker working with Fort Harrison. Colonel Hayes sent me to find any survivors and bring them safely to Pine Valley." A long pause. Then she appeared, emerging from between two boulders, a bundle clutched against her chest. Even from this distance, he could see how she swayed with exhaustion. "Stay where you are," she commanded, voice stronger than her trembling frame suggested. "Don't come closer." The bundle in her arms moved, and James heard a soft, mewling cry. Not one child, but two, he realized. Twins, from the similar sounds. "Ma'am, you need water and food, and those little ones do too. I've got both. I'm going to set them here, and then step back." He moved slowly, placing his canteen and a package of dried meat on a flat rock, then retreating several paces. Sarah watched, heart thundering. The man below was tall, broad-shouldered, his skin copper-toned, black hair pulled back with a leather cord. Cherokee by his features, though he wore a mix of native and settler clothing. A tracker, he'd said, here to help. But in a world that had just shattered around her, trust felt as fragile as morning frost. "They attacked without warning," she called down, voice breaking. "The whole train, everyone." James nodded gravely. "I know. I found the site. You're the only one we've found alive. The only one." The words fell like stones. All those families, all those children, gone. Emma shifted restlessly in the shared blanket, her small face pinched with hunger. Ethan had grown quiet, too quiet, over the past day. They needed help, whether this stranger was trustworthy or not. "I'm coming down," Sarah decided, her maternal instinct overriding caution. "But I'm warning you, I have a knife." James remained still as she picked her way carefully down the slope, one arm cradling the twins, the other steadying herself against rocks. When she reached the flat area where he waited, the full impact of her condition became clear. Her dress was torn and dirt-streaked, face gaunt with hunger, eyes huge with exhaustion and fear. The twins, barely visible in their tightly wrapped blanket, made weak, mewling sounds. "They need water," she said, all pretense of strength falling away. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Please." James held out the canteen, maintaining distance. "Small sips for the little ones. Their stomachs will be too empty for more." Sarah sank to the ground, arranging the twins in her lap. As she tipped the canteen to Emma's parched lips, James caught his first clear view of the children, identical faces, though one looked significantly weaker than the other. "How long were you in that cave?" he asked quietly. 7 days, maybe 8. I lost count." Sarah moved the canteen to Ethan's mouth, her hand trembling. "I ran when the attack started. Didn't think, just ran with them. By the time I realized how far we'd gone, it was too late to go back. Then I saw them, the attackers, returning to the site." "You did right," James assured her. "Nobody at that train survived except you 3. You saved your children." A tear tracked down Sarah's dirt-smudged cheek. "For what? To die slowly in a cave instead?" "You're not dying today," James said firmly. "Pine Valley is 2 days' ride. From here, my horse is strong enough to carry all 3 of you." Sarah looked up sharply. "Pine Valley? That's where we were headed. My husband's brother has land there." Her voice caught. "Had land. He died last winter, but his widow wrote that we'd be welcome, that there'd be a place for us." James nodded, understanding the desperate courage that had driven this woman to make such a journey alone with infant twins. "There still might be, but first, you need rest, and those babies need proper care." He moved slowly, telegraphing his movements, and knelt to unwrap a piece of soft cloth containing strips of dried meat. "For you, not them yet. Their stomachs won't handle it." Sarah took the offered food with shaking hands. As she chewed the tough jerky, James busied himself gathering wood for a small fire, giving her space to recover her dignity. "Which tribe attacked us?" she asked suddenly. James stiffened slightly. "Not Cherokee. From the signs, Blackfoot raiders, pushed south by fighting in the Northern Territories. Does it matter?" Her voice held no accusation, only exhaustion. "Dead is dead." "It matters," James said quietly, arranging kindling. "Because blame falls quickly, and often on the wrong shoulders." Sarah studied him over the tops of her children's heads. "You're caught in the middle," she observed. "Always have been." He struck his flint, catching the spark on dry tinder. "My father was white, a trapper. My mother, Cherokee, never quite, belonging to either world. Like my twins," Sarah murmured. "Their father was from Boston. I'm Virginia-born. Out here, there'll be nothing but frontier children growing up wild, forgetting where they came from." Something passed between them then, a recognition, an understanding. Both outsiders, both carrying responsibility for lives made vulnerable by circumstance. The fire caught, sending warm light dancing across their small camp. In its glow, Sarah's exhausted features softened slightly. The twins, having taken water, settled against her chest, their breathing easier. "My horse is tethered just down the slope," James said. "We'll rest here tonight, then head for Pine Valley at first light. Colonel Hayes will want to speak with you about what happened." Sarah nodded, then hesitated. The settlement, will they be welcoming to a widow with no husband, no means? James considered her question carefully. Pine Valley has good people, hard people too, shaped by hard country, but they look after their own. He paused. And they've lost too many not to value those who survive. As night settled fully around them, Sarah felt the crushing weight of the past week pressing down. She was alive, her children were alive, but the road ahead seemed as uncertain as the shadows dancing at the edge of their firelight. James sat across from her, alert yet relaxed, his presence oddly reassuring for a stranger, and a Cherokee. At that, everything she'd been taught said she should fear this man, mistrust him on sight. Yet he'd tracked her for days, not to harm, but to save. "How did you find us?" she asked, curiosity briefly overcoming exhaustion. "I was so careful not to leave signs." A hint of pride touched James's expression. "You were careful, yes, but desperation leaves its own trail. The place you gathered water, you left knee prints where you knelt. One of the little ones left handprints in mud. Small things, things most men would miss." Sarah glanced down at her sleeping twins. "They saved me, you know. If I'd been alone, I might have just..." She didn't finish the thought. "Having them meant I had to keep moving, keep trying." "That's how survival works," James replied. "We endure for others more easily than for ourselves." The fire crackled between them, a small island of warmth in the vast wilderness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the journey to Pine Valley, the questioning, the uncertain welcome. But tonight, for the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to truly breathe. What neither of them could know was how their reluctant meeting, a desperate mother and a tracker caught between worlds, would unsettle the careful balance of the settlement awaiting them. Or how the wilderness that had nearly claimed their lives would soon become their greatest sanctuary. Pine Valley appeared first as church spire rising above pine trees, then as scattered cabins and a stockade nestled in a broad valley cupped by mountains. James felt Sarah stiffen against his back as they approached, the twins secured against her chest in a makeshift sling he'd fashioned from his spare shirt. "Small place," she murmured, apprehension clear in her voice. "Small but growing," he replied. "Trading post mill, new schoolhouse going up, settlements barely 5 years old." What he didn't say was how rarely he ventured into town himself, preferring his isolated cabin to the sidelong glances and hushed whispers his presence inevitably provoked. The colonel valued his tracking skills enough to overlook his heritage. The townspeople tolerated him as a necessary evil, useful in crisis, invisible otherwise. The sentry at the gate straightened as they approached. "Walker," he acknowledged, gaze shifting curiously to Sarah and the twins. "This the survivor you went looking for?" "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell and her children," James confirmed, "only ones who made it. They need the doctor, food, and rest, in that order." The sentry stepped aside, but his expression had already shifted from curiosity to something harder, more judging. "Colonel's waiting at the trading post, said to bring you straight there." Sarah felt the change too, the slight cooling in the man's manner when he realized she'd been alone with the Cherokee tracker for days. Her chin lifted almost imperceptibly, dignity asserting itself despite her ragged appearance. James guided his horse through Pine Valley's single main street, aware of faces appearing in doorways and windows. News traveled faster than horses in settlements like this. By nightfall, everyone would know about the widow and her twins, saved by the half-Cherokee tracker, and everyone would have an opinion on what that meant. Colonel Nathaniel Hayes waited on the porch of Riverstone Trading Post, a weathered man with iron-gray hair and the rigid posture of someone who'd spent decades in military service. His eyes betrayed nothing as James helped Sarah dismount, though. They lingered briefly on the twins' faces, peeking from their improvised sling. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted formally. We're relieved to find you alive. When Walker reported tracks that might be survivors, I confess I had little hope. We survived because of Mr. Walker's skill, Sarah replied, her exhaustion evident but her voice steady. He found us when no one else could have. If the Colonel was surprised by her defense of James, he hid it well. Indeed, Walker has his uses. He turned, beckoning to a round-faced woman hovering nearby. Martha Wilson will see to your immediate needs. Food, bath, clean clothes for you and the little ones. Dr. Reed is making his rounds, but will check on you shortly. Martha stepped forward, her kind face creased with concern. You poor dear, come with me. My cabin's just behind the mercantile. We'll have you settled in no time. Sarah hesitated, glancing back at James, who stood impassively beside his horse. Go on, he said quietly. You're safe now. The Colonel and I need to debrief Walker on what he found, cut in William Bennett, the settlement leader, appearing from inside the trading post. His calculating gaze swept over Sarah, then settled coolly on James. The details of the attack are significant to our community's safety. Sarah understood the dismissal. She was being ushered away while the men discussed matters deemed too upsetting for female ears, or perhaps just matters they didn't want her to hear. But exhaustion and concern for her weakening children overrode her pride. Thank you, she said to James, meaning it more deeply than the simple words conveyed. Then she followed Martha Wilson, disappearing into the maze of log cabins. James watched her go, then turned to face the Colonel and Bennett, reading the unspoken tension in their expressions. Inside, Bennett directed shortly. The trading posts. Back rooms smelled of tobacco and leather. Maps covered one wall, marked with trade routes and tribal boundaries. Bennett wasted no time once the door closed behind them. Was it Cherokee? He demanded. Don't protect them if it was. James met his gaze steadily. It wasn't. Blackfoot raiders pushed south. They took scalps. Cherokee don't do that, not anymore. He's right, the Colonel confirmed reluctantly. The attack pattern matches reports from Montana Territory. Blackfoot War Party, likely the same group that hit the Sullivan homestead last month. Bennett seemed almost disappointed. And the woman? She's sure about what she saw? She didn't see much, James replied. She ran when the attack started. Smart move that saved her and those babies. Convenient, Bennett muttered. No witnesses. The Colonel shot him a warning look. William, 15 families were massacred. There's nothing convenient about it. Bennett had the grace to look abashed, but his suspicion toward James remained evident. And she was alone with you for how long? James felt a flash of anger but kept his expression neutral. 2 days. She was hiding in a cave with those infants, nearly starved, terrified I might be with the war party. You think she was concerning herself with propriety? The Colonel stepped between them. That's enough. Walker did what we asked. Found survivors against all odds. The woman's virtue is her own concern, not ours. Bennett subsided, but James knew the seed was planted. In a settlement this small, rumors grew like weeds after rain. What will happen to her? James asked. She mentioned a relation, a brother-in-law's. Widow? Rebecca Mitchell, the Colonel confirmed. Homestead about 2 miles west. Already notified her. She'll take them in, I expect. James nodded, relief easing some of his tension. At least Sarah and the twins wouldn't be entirely alone. If that's all, Colonel, I should see to my horse. Hayes studied him thoughtfully. Actually, Walker, I'd like you to stay in town a few days. If that Blackfoot war party is still in the territory, we may need your tracking skills again. It was an unusual request. James typically delivered his information, collected his payment, and returned to his cabin with minimal interaction. Staying in town meant enduring stares, whispers, the occasional drunk looking to prove himself against the breed. But the Colonel's expression suggested this wasn't truly a request, and somewhere in the back of James's mind, a concern for Sarah and her twins lingered. Would they truly be welcome here? Or would suspicion fall on them too by association with him? Fine, he agreed reluctantly. I'll take a room at the livery. Bennett frowned. Is that wise? People are scared after this attack. He caught himself. Having you so visible might stir up feelings best left settled. If you're worried about my safety, don't be, James replied coolly. I've managed worse than suspicious glances. The colonel cleared his throat. Walker stays, my authority, and Bennett, his voice hardened. Make it clear to everyone that he acts under my orders. Any trouble comes his way, it comes mine too. Bennett nodded stiffly and excused himself, leaving James alone with the colonel. You think there's still danger, James observed once the door closed. Hayes sighed heavily. Blackfoot rarely move. This far south without reason. Something's driving them, and I want to know what. But more than that, he hesitated. The Mitchell woman is the only witness to whatever happened out there. Until I'm certain we know everything, I want her where I can reach her, and I want you close enough to watch for signs of trouble. James understood the unspoken message. He wasn't staying for his tracking skills alone, but as another layer of protection for Sarah and her children. The realization sat uneasily with him, muddying the clear boundaries he preferred to maintain with the settlement. I'll stable my horse, he said finally, offering neither agreement nor refusal. Outside, the spring afternoon had turned chilly, clouds gathering over the mountain peaks. James led his tired mount toward the livery, aware of eyes following his progress. News had spread quickly. Settlers paused in their tasks to watch him pass, expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Near the church, a group of children playing with hoops stopped to stare openly. One small boy broke away, running toward James with the uninhibited curiosity of youth. "Did you really find a lady and babies in a cave?" he called, ignoring his mother's horrified gasp and attempt to call him back. James stopped, considering the child's earnest face. "I did." "Were there bears?" "My pa says caves have bears." Despite himself, James felt a smile tug at his mouth. "No bears in this one, just a very brave mother with two very quiet babies." The boy's eyes widened appreciatively. "I'm going to be a tracker when I grow up," he announced. "Find people like you do." Before James could respond, the boy's mother rushed forward, snatching his arm and pulling him back. "Tommy, I told you not to bother Mr. Walker," she scolded, her eyes never meeting James's face. "Come away now." Tommy allowed himself to be dragged off, but looked back over his shoulder with undimmed interest. James continued toward the livery, the brief interaction leaving him with an odd mixture of amusement and resignation. Children saw clearly until they were taught to look through clouded eyes. At the doctor's small cabin near the edge of town, Sarah sat wrapped in a borrowed robe, her hair still damp from the first real bath in over a week. Martha Wilson had been kindness itself, providing clean clothes, food, and privacy, clucking sympathetically over the twins' condition, but offering practical help rather than pity. Now Dr. Reed, a surprisingly young man with spectacles and a gentle manner, examined Ethan with careful hands. "Dehydrated, certainly, but no fever. That's promising," he murmured, listening to the baby's chest. "His sister seems stronger?" Sarah nodded. "Emma's always been the hardier of the two. Ethan took ill on the journey even before," she faltered. "Before the attack? Yes." Dr. Reed spoke matter-of-factly, which Sarah found more comforting than forced sympathy. "Well, we'll build them both back up. Goat's milk, thinned at first. Broth for you, you're nursing still." "When I can," Sarah admitted. "But with so little food these past days." "Your milk will return with proper nourishment," he assured her. "Until then, we'll supplement. Martha's sister keeps goats, fortunately." He finished his examination and stepped back, studying Sarah thoughtfully. "Colonel Hayes mentioned you were found by James Walker." Something in his tone made Sarah tense slightly. "Yes, he tracked us to the cave. We'd have died without his help." "I'm sure," Dr. Reed agreed, though a slight furrow appeared between his brows. "Walker is skilled at what he does." "But not welcome by all," Sarah finished for him, her exhaustion making her blunter than she might otherwise have been. The doctor adjusted his spectacles. "Pine Valley is a new settlement, Mrs. Mitchell. People are still learning to live together, to trust each other. Walker keeps to himself mostly, which doesn't help. Perhaps he keeps to himself because he's given reason to," Sarah suggested quietly. Dr. Reed smiled faintly. "Perhaps. In any case, you should know that your sister-in-law has been notified of your arrival. She'll be in town tomorrow to take you to her homestead." "Rebecca," Sarah murmured. "I've never met her. Thomas, my husband, hadn't seen his brother in years before we had word of his death. She's a good woman, keeps to herself since losing James Mitchell last winter, but respected. The homestead is prospering, from what I hear." This was welcome news. Sarah had made the journey west on little more than a letter from Rebecca, inviting her to share the homestead after Thomas's death left her nearly destitute in Boston. "Thank you, Doctor, for everything." He nodded, packing his instruments. "Rest now. Martha will look in on you, and I'll return this evening to check on young Ethan." Left alone with her sleeping twins, Sarah sank back against the pillows Martha had provided, physical comfort mingling uneasily with new worries. She had escaped death in the wilderness only to face subtler dangers here. Judgment, suspicion, the uncertain welcome of a sister-in-law she'd never met. And somewhere in her thoughts, the image of James Walker persisted. The tracker who'd found impossible trails. The man caught between worlds who treated her with more respect than many full-blooded white men she'd known. She wondered where he was now, whether he'd already left Pine Valley for whatever solitary place he called home. The thought brought an unexpected pang. In the wilderness, he had been strength and safety personified. Here, among civilization, he seemed more vulnerable than she. Outside the small window of Martha's guest room, snow began to fall, early for spring, but not unheard of in mountain country. Sarah watched the white flakes swirl against darkening sky, cradling her sleeping children close, and wondered what dawn would bring. The morning arrived with a gentle snowfall that dusted Pine Valley in pristine white. Sarah woke to the unfamiliar, comfort of a real bed, momentarily disoriented until Emma's soft cooing beside her brought reality rushing back. The massacre, the cave, the rescue. This borrowed room in Martha Wilson's cabin, with its patchwork quilt and faint scent of dried lavender. "There you are, dear," Martha bustled in, her round face creased with motherly concern. "Thought I heard movement. The little ones slept through?" Sarah nodded, checking Ethan, who remained asleep, his breathing steadier than it had been in days. "Better than they have in weeks." "A proper roof does wonders," Martha smiled, setting down a tray with steaming porridge and tea. "Dr. Reed left this for you, tincture for the boy to build his strength, said to take it with breakfast." Sarah accepted the small brown bottle, studying the handwritten label. "You've all been so kind." Martha's expression softened. "Terrible business. What happened to your wagon train? Could have been any of us." She hesitated. "Your sister-in-law should arrive by midday, weather permitting. Colonel sending an escort to her homestead. Make sure she gets through safe." The reminder of Rebecca's imminent arrival stirred Sarah's anxiety. A stranger who would determine her future, her children's future. What's she like, Rebecca Mitchell? Martha busied herself straightening bed covers. Keeps to herself mostly. Lost her husband, your husband's brother, last winter. Fever took him quick. Strong woman, though. Runs that homestead better than most men could. She paused. Bit particular in her ways. Devout. Sarah caught the hesitation. Particular how? Just set in her beliefs, values, reputation. Martha seemed reluctant to say more. She'll be a good provider for you and the little ones. That's what matters. Before Sarah could press further, a soft knock at the outer door drew Martha away. Sarah heard murmured voices, then Martha returned, her expression carefully neutral. Mr. Walker is asking after you and the children. Says the colonel sent him. Sarah's heartbeat quickened unexpectedly. Please ask him in. Martha's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. Moments later, James entered, filling the small room with his presence. He'd clearly made some effort with his appearance. Hair, neatly tied back, clean shirt beneath his buckskin jacket, boots wiped of mud. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing the angular planes of his face, softened somewhat by uncertainty. Mrs. Mitchell, he greeted formally. Colonel Hayes asked me to check that you have everything you need. Martha hovered nearby, her presence a quiet reminder of propriety. Sarah straightened, suddenly conscious of her borrowed nightgown and loose hair. We're much improved, thank you, she replied, gesturing to the twins. Dr. Reed has been attentive, and Mrs. Wilson most generous. James nodded, his gaze lingering briefly on the sleeping Ethan. The boys better. Getting there, they both are. An awkward silence fell. Martha cleared her throat pointedly. I'll just check on that bread I've got baking, she said, though her reluctance to leave was evident. Once alone, James spoke more naturally. Colonel's asked me to stay in town a few days, concerned the war party might still be in the territory. Sarah studied him. You don't usually stay in town. No. The single word carried layers of meaning. People get uncomfortable because you're Cherokee. Half, he corrected. Not enough for my mother's people, too much for my father's. Sarah shifted Emma to her other arm, considering him. In the wilderness, his heritage had seemed irrelevant compared to his skills, his help, his humanity. Here, within settlement boundaries, it defined him in ways that seemed suddenly, painfully obvious. Your sister-in-law arrives today, James continued, changing the subject. Rebecca Mitchell. I know her land. Good water, defensible position, fertile soil. You'll be comfortable there. Have you met her? Sarah asked. A shadow crossed his features. Once, when her husband was ill. Colonel sent me with medicine from the fort. He hesitated. She didn't invite me inside. The implication was clear. Rebecca Mitchell shared the settlement's views on Cherokee blood. Sarah's jaw tightened. She may control the land, Mr. Walker, but she doesn't control my gratitude. Without you, my children would be dead. I won't pretend otherwise. Something softened in James's expression. Most would find it easier to forget. New beginnings and all that. I've never chosen the easier path, Sarah replied. If I had, I'd still be in Boston, remarried to my late husband's business partner, as he so persistently suggested. This drew a surprised look from James, followed by the ghost of a smile that transformed his serious face. Somehow, that doesn't surprise me, Mrs. Mitchell. The moment was interrupted by Emma's sudden wail, her tiny face scrunching in hunger. Ethan stirred, responding to his sister's distress. I should let you tend to them, James said, replacing his hat. If you need anything. I'll ask for you, Sarah finished, meeting his gaze directly. Thank you for coming to check on us. He nodded, an unreadable expression crossing his features before he turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused. The settlement is planning a proper burial service tomorrow for those lost in the massacre. The colonel thought you might want to attend. The reminder of all she'd lost, not family, but companions on the journey, people whose names and faces had become familiar over weeks of shared hardship, hit Sarah with physical force. Yes, she managed, I would. After James left, Martha returned almost immediately, her curiosity poorly concealed. "That man," she said, shaking her head as she helped Sarah prepare milk for the twins, "never known him to make social calls." "It wasn't social," Sarah corrected. "The Colonel sent him." Martha made a non-committal sound. "Well, he's good at what he does. No denying, just—" She hesitated. "People talk is all. A woman alone, found by a man like that, a man who saved 3 lives at considerable risk to his own," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp enough that Martha blinked in surprise. "My children are alive because of James Walker. I won't pretend, otherwise to spare anyone's sensibilities." Martha studied her with new interest. "You've got spine, Mrs. Mitchell. You'll need it." She glanced toward the window. "Snow's letting up. Your sister-in-law will likely be here before noon." She patted Sarah's hand. "Just tread carefully. Rebecca Mitchell has strong views on how things ought to be, and she'll be your children's provider now." The warning hung in the air after Martha left. Sarah fed the twins with mechanical movements, her mind racing. She had come west with dreams of family, stability, a place to raise her children among kin. Now she faced dependence on a stranger with strong views who might judge her for the very rescue that had saved her life. By mid-morning, Sarah had dressed in borrowed clothes, her hair neatly braided, the twins wrapped in clean blankets. She sat by the window of Martha's small parlor, watching the settlement's main street, where people moved about their business in the fresh snow. Twice she caught glimpses of James Walker, once leading his horse to water, once in conversation with a grizzled man she took to be a trapper. Each time, she noted how others gave him wide berth, the occasional hostile glance thrown his way. When the small procession appeared at the settlement's edge, Sarah's hands tightened involuntarily on Emma's blanket. 4 riders, 2 soldiers from the fort, a thin woman on a sturdy mare, and a 4th man she recognized as Bennett, the settlement leader. "That'll be Rebecca now," Martha said, appearing at her shoulder, "and the escort." Sarah rose, heart pounding. This moment would determine her future, her children's future. She smoothed the borrowed dress, checked the twins one last time, and took a steadying breath. The knock came minutes later. Martha opened the door to reveal a woman, perhaps 10 years Sarah's senior, her face narrow and weathered by frontier life, her posture rigid as a fence post. Rebecca Mitchell wore practical clothes, a dark woolen dress, sturdy coat, leather gloves, but with a neatness that bordered on severity. Her hair, streaked with early gray, was pulled back without a strand out of place. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, moved immediately to the twins in Sarah's arms. "Mrs. Mitchell," Martha greeted warmly, "please come in. Your sister-in-law has been eagerly awaiting you." Rebecca stepped inside, removing her gloves with precise movements. "Mrs. Wilson," she acknowledged, then turned to Sarah. "So, you're Thomas's widow." The words held neither warmth nor coldness, merely fact. Sarah straightened her spine. "Yes, I'm Sarah Mitchell, and these are Emma and Ethan." Rebecca moved closer, examining the twins with an appraising gaze that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of a merchant assessing goods. "They favor him," she said finally. "James, I mean, my husband. Same eyes." Sarah hadn't expected this observation, this connection to a family resemblance she couldn't see herself. "I wouldn't know," she said softly. "I never met your husband." "No," Rebecca agreed. "The Mitchell brothers weren't ones for family gatherings." She reached out one finger, touching Ethan's cheek with unexpected gentleness. "Colonel Hayes told me what happened, the attack, how you were found." There it was, the real assessment about to begin. Sarah met her gaze steadily. "We survived by God's grace and Mr. Walker's skill." Rebecca's expression tightened slightly. "At James's name, Indeed, Providence works in unexpected ways. She straightened. My wagon's outside. Dr. Reed tells me the children are fit to travel the short distance to the homestead. I've prepared a room for you. The businesslike tone was neither welcoming nor rejecting, simply practical. Sarah found herself both relieved and disappointed. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, for some warmth, some connection to this woman, who was now her only family. "That's very kind," she managed. "We won't be a burden for long. Once I'm established, I can contribute." "We'll discuss all that later," Rebecca cut in. "For now, you need rest and proper food. The children need stability." She glanced around. "Your belongings." "Everything was lost," Sarah said quietly, "when we ran from the wagons." Something flickered in Rebecca's eyes, perhaps genuine sympathy. "Then we start fresh. I have some things that might fit you, and there are baby clothes stored away. James and I," she faltered slightly, "we had hoped for children." This glimpse of shared loss, of vulnerability, softened the space between them momentarily. Sarah nodded. "Thank you." Martha helped gather the few items loaned to Sarah: a shawl, a baby blanket, the medicine from Dr. Reed. Outside, Colonel Hayes had joined the waiting group, speaking quietly with Bennett, while the soldiers remained mounted, scanning the surroundings with professional wariness. As Sarah stepped out, bundle in her arms, she was acutely aware of the gathered onlookers, townsfolk, pausing in their tasks to watch this small drama unfold. The massacre survivor and her twins being collected by the widow, Mitchell. She held her head high, determined not to show the uncertainty churning within. Hayes approached, touching his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Mitchell, we're glad to see you, and the little ones recovering. Mrs. Mitchell," he nodded to Rebecca, "has kindly agreed to take you in. 2 of my men will escort you to the homestead, just a precaution." "Thank you, Colonel," Sarah replied, "for everything, for sending Mr. Walker to find us." At James's name, she saw Rebecca stiffen almost imperceptibly. Hayes merely nodded. "Walker did his job well, always does." Sarah scanned the gathered faces, looking for James among them, but he was nowhere to be seen. Something like disappointment settled in her chest. Had she hoped for a farewell? Some acknowledgement of the connection forged in those desperate days? Rebecca's wagon was simple but well maintained, a canvas cover protecting the bed from lingering snowfall. A young man, barely more than a boy, held the reins, nodding respectfully as they approached. "This is Daniel," Rebecca explained. "He helps at the homestead. His family has the neighboring property." Daniel tipped his hat, eyes widening slightly at the sight of the twins. "Mom," he greeted Sarah, "got everything comfortable for you in the back." Sure enough, the wagon bed had been arranged with blankets, pillows, and even a small brazier of hot coals for warmth. Rebecca supervised as Sarah climbed in with the twins, arranging herself against the cushioned support. "It's about an hour's ride," Rebecca explained, settling beside her. "The snow slows us some, but the road's passable." As Daniel clicked to the horses and the wagon began to move, Sarah caught a movement from the corner of her eye. James Walker stood at the edge of the livery stable, watching their departure. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. He didn't wave or call out, merely inclined his head in a gesture that somehow conveyed more than words could have. Sarah returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement of all that had passed between them, before the wagon rounded a corner and he disappeared from view. The journey to the Mitchell homestead passed in relative silence. Rebecca spoke occasionally, pointing out landmarks or explaining aspects of the property they were approaching, but she asked no personal questions, made no attempt at the kind of intimate conversation one might expect between new family members. The soldiers rode ahead and behind, scanning the tree line with wary eyes, a reminder that danger still lurked in the territory. Sarah used the time to observe her new surroundings. The valley opened gradually into rolling meadows, bisected by a creek swollen with spring melt. Stands of pine provided natural windbreaks, and in the distance, a thin column of smoke indicated their destination. The homestead itself appeared suddenly as they crested a small rise, a substantial log house with a stone chimney, a barn, corral, and several outbuildings arranged in a defensive semicircle. A split-rail fence enclosed a kitchen garden, dormant now, but clearly well-tended in season. It was larger, more established than Sarah had expected. James built most of it himself, Rebecca said, following Sarah's gaze. He had a way with wood, could look at a tree and see the beam or door or chair inside it, waiting to come out. It was the first time Rebecca had volunteered anything personal about her husband, and Sarah seized the opening. "How long were you married?" 17 years, Rebecca replied. "Came out from Pennsylvania when this was all wilderness. No settlement, just scattered trappers and the native tribes." Her mouth tightened. "Wasn't easy." "I can imagine," Sarah said softly, glancing down at the twins. "I was with Thomas only 3 years before the fever took him. The twins were just 3 months old." Rebecca nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Men leave us too soon out. Here, that's why women must be strong." She straightened as they approached the house. "And careful." Before Sarah could ask what she meant by this last remark, Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop before the house. One of the soldiers dismounted, checked the surroundings with professional thoroughness, then nodded. "All clear, Mrs. Mitchell. We'll help you get settled, then head back to report to the colonel." Rebecca climbed down with practiced ease, then reached up to take Ethan while Sarah managed Emma and herself. The front door of the house opened to reveal a young woman with a round face and capable hands. "This is Mary," Rebecca explained. "Daniel's sister. She helps with the housekeeping." Mary bobbed a quick curtsy, eyes bright with curiosity at the sight of the twins. "Got everything ready, Mrs. Mitchell. Fires built up in the bedroom like you asked." The interior of the house struck Sarah immediately with its orderliness. Every surface gleamed with polish, every item placed with deliberate care. The main room held a stone fireplace, table and chairs made of solid pine, and a few pieces of more refined furniture that had clearly made the journey from the east. A rocking chair with carved arms, a secretary desk with small drawers, a pendulum clock ticking steadily on the wall. But what caught Sarah's eye were the samplers. Framed needlework hanging on every wall, each bearing a Bible verse rendered in meticulously stitched letters. "The Lord is my shepherd. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Rebecca followed her gaze. "My handiwork. Winters are long. Keeps my hands busy and my mind focused on what matters." Sarah nodded, understanding better the kind of household she had entered. Her own faith was quieter, less demonstrative. Thomas had been a sporadic churchgoer at best, but she recognized the rigid certainty of the truly devout, those who saw the world in clear divisions of right and wrong, proper and improper. "Mary will show you to your room," Rebecca continued. "I've had a cradle brought down from the attic. James made it. Years ago, should fit both little ones for now." The room prepared for them was small but comfortable. A single bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with pitcher and bowl, a chest for clothing, and a rocking chair placed near the window. The promised cradle sat at the bed's foot, sturdy, pine rubbed to a warm glow by years of expectant hands. "It's lovely," Sarah said sincerely. "Thank you." Rebecca nodded, her expression unreadable. "Rest now. Mary will bring you something to eat later. Tomorrow, when you're settled, we'll talk about arrangements." Left alone with her children for the first time in true safety, Sarah sank onto the bed, emotions overwhelming her. She was alive, her babies were alive. They had shelter, food, protection. Yet underneath the gratitude ran currents of uncertainty, of loss, of the disorienting sensation of having survived one peril only to face less obvious dangers. She laid the twins in the cradle, touching their soft cheeks with wondering fingers. "We made it," she whispered. "We're safe now." But as she spoke the words, she found herself thinking of James Walker, of the calm strength in his gaze when they'd parted. Where was he now? Still in the settlement, enduring suspicious glances? Or had he returned to whatever solitary place he called home? And why should his fate concern her at all, when she had her children to think of, her own precarious position to secure? Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the unfamiliar landscape stretching to distant mountains. This was her world now. This house with its biblical injunctions, this land with its beauty and danger, these people with their frontier strength and frontier prejudices. She had survived the wilderness. Now she would have to navigate civilization. The days fell into a rhythm at the Mitchell homestead. Sarah recovered her strength quickly, the twins thriving under regular feeding and warm shelter. Rebecca maintained her reserved demeanor, but proved a fair provider, ensuring Sarah had everything needed for the children, showing her the workings of the household, including her gradually in the daily tasks. Still, an invisible line seemed drawn between them, a boundary Sarah couldn't quite identify and didn't dare cross. Rebecca spoke little of her husband, nothing of her life before the frontier, and asked few personal questions. Her faith dominated the household routine. Bible readings morning and evening, grace before meals, strict observance of the Sabbath. A week after their arrival, as they worked together stringing dried apples in the kitchen, Rebecca finally broached the subject Sarah had been anticipating. "The memorial service for the wagon train victims is tomorrow," she said, hands steady with her knife. "Colonel Hayes sent word. They've marked graves in the settlement cemetery, though, of course—" She didn't finish the thought that there were no bodies to bury. The victims left where they fell in the ravine. "I'd like to attend," Sarah said, "to pay respects." Rebecca nodded. "I'll have Daniel bring the wagon around after breakfast. Mary can mind the twins." Sarah looked up from her work. "I'd prefer to bring them. They should be there." A slight frown creased Rebecca's forehead. "Infants at a funeral service? Hardly appropriate. And the weather—" "With respect," Sarah interrupted gently but firmly. "These children survived that attack. Whatever remembrance is offered belongs to them too." Rebecca studied her for a long moment, as if reassessing her estimation of her sister-in-law's character. "Very well," she said finally, "but you'll need proper mourning clothes. I have a black dress that can be altered." Later that evening, as Sarah sat by the fire nursing the twins before bed, Rebecca appeared with a bundle of black fabric. "My second-best funeral dress," she explained. "Mary and I can take it in tomorrow morning." Sarah accepted the offering with thanks. As Rebecca turned to leave, a question that had been lingering for days finally found voice. "Will Mr. Walker be at the service?" Rebecca paused, her back stiffening slightly. "I couldn't say. Such ceremonies are generally for the settlement and fort personnel." She turned, her expression carefully composed. "Your connection to Mr. Walker is professional, I understand. He located you at the Colonel's request." The careful phrasing, the deliberate distance placed around James's name, told Sarah everything. Rebecca had heard the whispers, the implications. A woman alone with a Cherokee for days. "He saved our lives," Sarah said simply. "Without him, your niece and nephew wouldn't be here." Rebecca's gaze dropped to the twins. "Providence works through unlikely instruments at times," she conceded. "But now that you're safe, under proper protection, such connections are unnecessary." The warning was clear, if gently delivered. Association with James Walker would not be viewed favorably, might even jeopardize Sarah's standing in her new home. "I understand your concern," Sarah said carefully. but I won't pretend not to know the man who risked himself to save my children." Rebecca's lips thinned. "The territory isn't Boston, Sarah. A woman's reputation is her only currency here, especially a widow with children to consider." She softened her tone. "I'm not unsympathetic, but I've survived here by understanding what can and cannot be challenged." After Rebecca left, Sarah sat long in the firelight, her sleeping twins cradled against her. The wilderness had stripped away so many certainties, burned her world down to its essential truth. Her children must survive. She had endured hunger, terror, and despair for that single purpose. Now, in safety, she faced a different kind of survival, one that demanded compromise, conformity, the careful navigation of social expectations. Was her gratitude to James Walker worth the potential cost to her children's security, worth risking Rebecca's protection and goodwill? She had no answers, only the weight of choices pressing down like the mountain snow outside. Morning brought heavy clouds and the promise of more snow. Sarah dressed in the altered black dress, its somber lines emphasizing her still thin frame. Rebecca had provided black ribbons for the twins' white gowns, a concession to mourning that seemed both touching and oddly formal for infants. Daniel brought the wagon around after breakfast, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Rebecca appeared in her own mourning attire, severe black, relieved only by a jet brooch at her throat, a memento of her husband, perhaps. "The settlement will be watching," she said quietly, as they settled the twins in the wagon. "How you carry yourself matters. These are people who may someday determine your children's place here." Sarah nodded, understanding the warning beneath the advice. She was being evaluated, judged by standards she was still learning. Her behavior at this public ceremony would establish her reputation in ways that might follow her children for years to come. The journey to Pine Valley passed in silence, broken only by the twins' occasional sounds and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves. Snow began to fall as they approached the settlement, soft flakes catching on their black clothing like scattered stars. The entire community had gathered at the small cemetery beside the church, settlers in their best clothes, soldiers in formal uniforms. Even the trappers and hunters who normally avoided town had come to pay respects. Colonel Hayes stood with Dr. Reed and the young minister, heads bowed in conversation. As Daniel helped them from the wagon, Sarah scanned the gathering, her gaze seeking without conscious intent. There, at the very edge of the crowd, tall and straight-backed, stood James Walker. He wore a clean shirt and dark jacket, his usual buckskins replaced by more formal attire. Yet he remained apart, maintaining a respectful distance that spoke volumes about his uncertain place in this community. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Sarah felt Rebecca tense beside her, noticing the exchange. She inclined her head slightly. In James's direction, the barest acknowledgement, but unmistakable to anyone watching. "Sarah," Rebecca murmured in warning. "It's simple courtesy," Sarah replied softly, adjusting Emma in her arms. "Nothing more." The service began with the minister's prayers, followed by Colonel Hayes's formal recounting of the tragedy. 15 families lost, men, women, children, an attack without provocation or warning. The colonel's voice remained steady, but his eyes held genuine grief. This was not the first such tragedy he had witnessed, nor likely the last. "We remember today those who sought new beginnings in our territory," he concluded, "and we recognize the providence that spared one family, a mother and her twin infants, through courage, determination, and the skill of our trusted scout." At these words, several heads turned toward James, acknowledgments reluctantly given. Others glanced at Sarah, assessing the woman who had survived when so many hadn't. She felt the weight of their gazes, The unspoken questions. Why her? Why had she lived when others died? What connection existed between her and the half-Cherokee tracker who had found her? The minister invited Sarah forward to place symbolic flowers on the memorial marker. She stepped forward, twins in arms, aware of every eye upon her. The memorial was simple, a wooden cross bearing the names of the 15 families lost, hastily carved but with evident care. As she laid the flowers at its base, Sarah felt the full weight of her survival. These people had shared her journey, broken bread with her, helped mind her babies on difficult trails. Now they were gone, and she remained. The unfairness of it, the randomness, threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "May they find peace," she whispered, unsure if her words were prayer or wish or desperate hope. Returning to Rebecca's side, Sarah caught James watching her, his expression reflecting understanding no one else could share. He alone had seen the cave, the desperate measures she'd taken to keep her children alive. He alone knew the true cost of her survival. The service concluded with hymns, the settlement's voices rising thin but determined against the falling snow. As people began to disperse, Colonel Hayes approached, removing his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell," he nodded to Rebecca. "A sad occasion but necessary. Closure is important." "Your words were most appropriate, Colonel," Rebecca replied formally. Hayes turned to Sarah. "How are you finding your new home? Settling in well?" "Very well, thank you," Sarah answered. "Rebecca has been most generous. Family is what matters in this territory," Hayes said with approval. "Speaking of which," he hesitated, "I've had word from the fort commander. We're organizing a proper expedition to recover what we can from the wagon train site. Personal effects, anything that might be returned to surviving relatives back. East." Sarah felt her heart stutter. "My husband's watch," she said suddenly. "It was in my trunk, his letters, the children's birth records. Items she'd thought lost forever, fragments of the life destroyed." Hayes nodded sympathetically. "No promises, but if they can be found, they will be. Walker will guide the expedition. Knows the site better than anyone." At James's name, Rebecca interjected smoothly. "How kind of the fort to make such efforts, Colonel. When will this expedition take place?" "Soon as weather permits. Week or so, perhaps." Hayes glanced over his shoulder to where James stood talking with one of the soldiers. Walker's agreed to delay his return home to assist. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Reed, coming to inquire after Ethan's health. As the men spoke, Sarah found her gaze drawn again to James. He stood straight and dignified in his formal clothes, yet still apart, included in duty, but excluded from belonging. The snow fell heavier now, blurring the boundaries between settlement and wilderness. Tomorrow they would return to the homestead, to the careful routine Rebecca had established, to the gradual negotiation of Sarah's place in this new family. But today, standing in this cemetery among strangers who might someday become community, Sarah felt the weight of choices yet to be made. She had survived the wilderness by instinct, desperation, and luck. Surviving civilization would require different skills, compromise perhaps, but not surrender. For her children's sake, she would learn the rules of this new world. But she would not forget the truth of the old one, or the man who had bridged both to bring her to safety. As if feeling her thoughts, James looked up, meeting her gaze across the gathering. No words passed between them, no acknowledgement beyond that silent connection. But in that moment, Sarah knew with bone-deep certainty that their paths would cross again. The wilderness had bound them in ways civilization could not easily sever. Rebecca touched her arm gently. "It's time to go," she said. "The snow's getting worse." Sarah nodded, allowing herself to be guided back toward the waiting wagon. As they departed, she felt James watching, his tall figure gradually obscured by falling snow until he disappeared entirely from view. but not, she knew from her story. A week passed at the Mitchell homestead, winter holding its grip on the valley, despite the calendar's insistence that spring had arrived. Sarah settled into routines, feeding the twins, helping with household tasks, learning the rhythms of this new life. Rebecca remained formal but fair, her reserve occasionally softening when the twins achieved some small milestone. Ethan's first attempt to roll over, Emma's newfound ability to grasp objects with determined fingers. The promised expedition to the wagon train site had been delayed by heavy snow in the mountain passes. Each day, Sarah found herself watching the weather, anticipating news, wondering if James Walker waited too, or if he had returned to his solitary cabin somewhere in the territory's wild reaches. She was hanging laundry in the bitter cold, taking advantage of a rare sunny morning, when Daniel rode into the yard at a canter, his expression animated with news. "Riders coming," he called to Rebecca, who emerged from the root cellar with a basket of preserved vegetables. "Soldiers from the fort, looks like, and Walker with them." Rebecca's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "How many?" "4, plus Walker," Daniel replied. "Colonel Hayes among them." "They'll be cold and hungry," Rebecca said after a moment's hesitation. "Mary, put coffee on. Daniel, see to their horses when they arrive." Sarah continued hanging laundry, her movements suddenly mechanical as her mind raced. James was coming here, to the homestead. What did it mean? Had they found something from the wagon train? Or was this another mission entirely? She was acutely aware of her appearance. Hair hastily braided that morning, borrowed dress dusted with flour from helping Mary bake bread, cheeks flushed from cold, and now, perhaps, something else. Rebecca shot her a measuring look, then said quietly, "You might want to tidy yourself. The colonel will expect some formality." 20 minutes later, wearing her one decent dress, the black one from the memorial service, now repurposed for daily wear, Sarah stood beside Rebecca on the porch as the riders approached. Colonel Hayes led the party, followed by 2 soldiers, a civilian she didn't recognize, and finally James Walker, his familiar figure unmistakable even at a distance. "Mrs. Mitchell," Hayes greeted, dismounting with military precision. "Mrs. Mitchell," he acknowledged Sarah. "Apologies for arriving unannounced. We're on our way to the wagon train site and thought to stop, as we had news that might interest you." Rebecca invited them in with proper frontier hospitality, though Sarah noticed she positioned herself subtly between her and James as they entered the house. Inside, Mary had prepared coffee and sliced fresh bread, the simple offering all that could be managed on short notice. Only when the men were seated with steaming cups did Hayes address Sarah directly. "We've had scouts return from near the attack site," he explained. "The weather's finally cleared enough for safe passage. We're heading out to recover what we can and properly bury any remains." He nodded to the civilian. "Mr. Perkins here represents the Territorial Governor's office. He'll document everything for official records and for notification of next of kin back east." The man named Perkins, thin and precise-looking with ink-stained fingers, nodded solemnly. "A terrible business, ma'am. My sincere condolences." Sarah murmured thanks, her gaze drawn inevitably to James, who stood slightly apart from the others, his cup untouched. He met her eyes briefly, his expression carefully neutral in this public setting. "What we came to ask," Hayes continued, "is whether you'd be willing to provide a written account of what you witnessed, for the territorial record and for the families of those lost. As the only survivor—" "Absolutely not," Rebecca interrupted, her voice sharp with sudden authority. "My sister-in-law has been through an ordeal no woman should face. To ask her to relive it for some government paper—" "I'll do it," Sarah said quietly. Rebecca turned to her, surprise and disapproval evident. "Sarah, you don't understand what you're agreeing to. The trauma of recounting such events—" I understand perfectly, Sarah replied, her voice gentle but firm. Those families deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. I'd want the same if our positions were reversed. Hayes nodded approval. Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. Mr. Perkins can take your statement before we depart. There's something else, James spoke for the first time, his deep voice drawing all eyes. The scouts found personal effects scattered near the site, a trunk with broken hinges, contents partially exposed. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small object, wrapped in soft leather. I recognized the description. Sarah's heart seemed to stop as he stepped forward, carefully maintaining a proper distance, and extended the package. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it, revealing a silver pocket watch. Thomas's watch, the one possession of his father's, he had treasured above all others. "Oh," she breathed, fingers tracing the familiar engraving on its case. "I never thought I'd see this again." "There may be more," James said. "The expedition will gather whatever can be salvaged." Rebecca observed this exchange with unreadable eyes. How fortunate that Mr. Walker remembered such a specific item among all the chaos, she remarked, her tone just shy of suspicious. "Sarah described it when we found her," James replied evenly. "A silver watch with her husband's initials and a rose engraved on the case. It seemed important to her." The simple explanation hung in the air, truth evident in its straightforwardness. Sarah closed her fingers around the watch, this tangible connection to Thomas, to the life before. "Thank you," she said, meeting James's gaze directly. "This means more than I can express." A moment of silence followed, broken by Hayes clearing his throat. "If you're amenable, Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Perkins could take your statement now. We aim to reach the foothills by nightfall." Rebecca looked as if she might object again, but Sarah spoke first. "Of course. Is there somewhere private we might speak?" "The study," Rebecca conceded reluctantly. "Mary can mind the twins." As Sarah led Perkins toward the small room that had once been James Mitchell's study, she was aware of Rebecca engaging the colonel in conversation, deliberately drawing attention away from James, who remained standing near the doorway, neither fully included nor explicitly excluded. The study was a masculine space, unchanged since its owner's death. A desk of solid oak, bookshelves lined with practical volumes on agriculture and territory law, a worn leather chair. A faint scent of pipe tobacco lingered, though Sarah suspected Rebecca would never have permitted smoking inside her immaculate home. A ghost of her husband's rebellion, perhaps. Perkins set out paper, inkwell and pens with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to documentation. "In your own words, Mrs. Mitchell," he instructed, "begin with the departure of the wagon train and continue through to your rescue. Leave nothing out, however distressing." For the next hour, Sarah relived those terrible days. The attacks, sudden violence, her desperate flight with the twins, the cave that became both sanctuary and prison, the slow erosion of hope as supplies dwindled. Perkins wrote without comment, his pen scratching steadily across the paper, pausing only to dip for more ink. When she reached the moment of James's appearance, her narrative slowed, becoming more detailed. "I heard stones sliding on the slope. Below the cave, someone tracking us. I was certain it was the attackers returning, that we'd be killed after all those days of surviving. Then he called out, said he was from the fort, looking for survivors." "And you believed him immediately?" Perkins asked, his first interruption. Sarah considered. "No, not immediately, but he showed himself, moved away from his weapon, offered food and water without approaching. He was careful, respectful of my fear." Perkins nodded, continuing to write. "And during the journey back to the settlement, 2 days, I believe." Sarah felt the question's implication. "Mr. Walker made camp each night with proper distance between us. He hunted food, carried my son when he grew too weak for me to manage both twins." Without his knowledge of the territory, we would never have reached Pine Valley. Your testimony speaks highly of him, Perkins observed neutrally. I speak the truth, Sarah replied simply. He saved 3 lives at considerable personal risk. Whatever opinions others hold of Mr. Walker's heritage have no bearing on his actions or his character. Perkins' eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment, finishing his transcription in silence. When done, he sprinkled sand to dry the ink, then presented the pages for her review. If you'd sign at the bottom, Mrs. Mitchell. This will become part of the territorial record. Sarah signed with deliberate strokes, knowing her words might be read by officials, by the families of those lost, perhaps even, someday, by her own children. She had spoken truth as she experienced it, without embellishment or omission. When they returned to the main room, she found the atmosphere subtly changed. Rebecca stood near the fireplace, her posture rigid with barely concealed tension. Colonel Hayes and his men were preparing to depart, gathering gloves and hats. James was nowhere to be seen. All finished? Hayes inquired, accepting the folded papers from Perkins. Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. This will help bring some closure to the families back east. Sarah looked around. Has Mr. Walker already departed? A flash of something, disapproval perhaps, crossed Rebecca's features before she smoothed them into polite neutrality. He thought it best to check the trail conditions. The men will be leaving momentarily. The dismissal in her tone was unmistakable. James had been sent away or had removed himself to avoid further interaction with Sarah. The realization stung more than she would have anticipated. Hayes donned his hat. We should return within a week, weather permitting. If we find any. More of your personal effects, Mrs. Mitchell. We'll bring them directly. Outside, the men mounted their horses, breath clouding in the cold air. Sarah stepped onto the porch, despite Rebecca's pointed suggestion that the twins would be needing attention. She searched the group, finally locating James already mounted, positioned at the edge of the party. Mr. Walker, she called, her voice carrying in the crisp air. He turned, surprise evident in his expression. Thank you, Sarah said clearly, holding up the watch, for remembering, for finding this piece of our past. James nodded once, solemn and dignified. There may be more, he replied. I'll look carefully. The simple exchange carried more weight than the words themselves, an acknowledgement of connection, of something shared that others could not fully understand. From the doorway, Sarah felt Rebecca's disapproving presence, but did not turn. As the riders departed, Sarah remained on the porch until they disappeared around the bend in the trail. Only then did she face her sister-in-law, whose expression had hardened into something approaching genuine anger. That was unnecessary, Rebecca said tightly, and inappropriate. Thanking the man who saved my children and recovered my husband's watch, I consider it the bare minimum of courtesy. Rebecca stepped closer, lowering her voice, though no one remained to overhear. You do not understand your position here, Sarah. This territory runs on reputation and standing. Your association with Walker is one of rescuer and rescued, Sarah interrupted, her own anger rising. Nothing more, nothing less. If people choose to imagine otherwise, that is their failing, not mine. It becomes your failing when it affects your children's future, Rebecca countered. Do you think Ethan and Emma won't suffer for their mother's unconventional associations? This isn't Boston, with its polite society and liberal thinking. This is frontier country. Judgments here are swift and lasting. The mention of her children struck home, as Rebecca had surely intended. Sarah felt her resolve waver, uncertainty creeping in. She had survived to protect them. Would her principles now endanger their place in this community? I won't pretend not to know him, she said finally, more subdued. I won't deny what he did for us, but I take your point about discretion. This concession seemed to satisfy Rebecca momentarily. Good. Now the twins are likely hungry, and Mary needs help with the midday meal. The brief confrontation settled into uneasy truce, both women returning to the safe territory of domestic tasks. But as Sarah nursed the twins in the privacy of her room, she found herself turning Thomas's watch over and over in her hand, its weight both comfort and burden. James had remembered, had recognized its importance to her from a single conversation. In their desperate flight to safety, had taken care to bring it personally. These were not the actions of a man who deserved to be dismissed or denied. Yet Rebecca was right about one thing. This territory operated by its own rules, its own judgments, and Sarah's children would live with the consequences of her choices long after the story of their rescue faded from memory. The expedition to the wagon train site dominated Sarah's thoughts in the days that followed. She found herself calculating distances, imagining their progress, wondering what further remnants of her former life might be recovered. Each morning she checked the weather, noting with relief when the skies remained clear, with anxiety when clouds gathered over the mountains. Rebecca observed this preoccupation with evident disapproval, but made no further comment on the matter. Their relationship had settled into a careful formality, civil, occasionally warm when the twins were concerned, but marked by an unspoken tension that neither seemed willing to address directly. On the fifth day after the expedition's departure, as Sarah hung laundry in weak sunshine, she spotted a lone rider approaching from the direction of Pine Valley. Not the full party returning, just a single horseman moving at an unhurried pace. "Rebecca," she called toward the house, "someone's coming." Her sister-in-law emerged, shading her eyes against the glare of sun on lingering snow. Her posture stiffened. "It's Walker." Sarah's hand stilled on the wet cloth. James, riding alone. Why? Had something happened to the expedition? Had they found something significant among the wagon train ruins? Rebecca moved to stand beside her, voice low and tense. "This is precisely what I warned about. His coming here, alone, with no official business." "We don't know why he's come," Sarah interrupted, watching as James approached the property boundary. "Perhaps the colonel sent him with news." "Then the colonel should have come himself," Rebecca replied, "or sent a proper soldier." The criticism stung, not for herself but for James, constantly judged by standards applied to no one else. "He is a proper scout," Sarah said quietly. "The best in the territory, by all accounts. You know very well what I mean." Sarah sighed, suddenly tired of the constant negotiation, the weighting of every word and gesture against frontier propriety. "Yes, I know what you mean, and I reject it entirely." Before Rebecca could respond, James had reached the yard. He dismounted with fluid grace, removing his hat as he approached the two women. His face showed signs of the expedition's rigors, new lines of fatigue around his eyes, several days' growth of beard, clothes trail-worn and dusty. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted Rebecca formally, then turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell." Despite his evident exhaustion, his gaze held steady, assessing. "I hope I find you well." "What brings you to my property, Mr. Walker?" Rebecca asked, making no gesture of welcome, offering none of the hospitality that was standard frontier courtesy. If James noticed the slight, he gave no indication. "Colonel, Hayes sent me ahead with news and recovered items. The main party follows a day behind, slowed by wagons carrying the remains." The grim reality of his mission struck Sarah anew. These weren't simply abandoned possessions being recovered, but the bodies of those who had traveled beside her, shared meals with her, helped mind her twins on difficult stretches of trail. "What news?" she asked softly. James reached into his saddlebag, producing a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Personal effects found at the site. letters with your name, a small box of jewelry, some papers that appeared important, land deeds, birth records for the children. Sarah's breath caught. The documents that proved the twins' legitimacy, their rightful claim to their father's name, and whatever modest inheritance might someday come from his family. She had thought them lost forever. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting the bundle with trembling hands. "These are beyond valuable." James nodded once, understanding evident in his expression. Then, addressing Rebecca more directly, "The Colonel also asked me to inform you that the burial service for the recovered remains will be held 3 days from now. He thought you might wish to attend, given your connection to Mrs. Mitchell and her children." Rebecca's stance softened slightly at this official communication. "Please tell the Colonel we appreciate the information. We will, of course, attend to pay proper respects. There's one more thing." James hesitated, his usual confidence wavering slightly. "Among the wreckage, we found evidence that the attack was not what it first appeared." Both women stilled. "What do you mean?" Rebecca asked. "The initial assumption was a tribal raiding party targeting the wagons for goods. But the pattern of the attack, the items left behind..." James shook his head. "It appears more deliberate, targeted." "Targeted how?" Sarah pressed. "Several wagons were searched thoroughly before being burned, items of value ignored, paperwork taken. The Colonel believes they were looking for something specific or someone." The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah felt cold suddenly, despite the sunshine. "You think they were looking for me? For my children?" James chose his words carefully. "The Colonel thinks it's worth considering. Your wagon was the last one attacked, according to the evidence. And you mentioned that your husband's business partner was insistent about your returning to Boston after his death." Sarah's mind raced back to Thomas's partner, Harold Winters, his increasingly forceful suggestions that she marry him after an indecently brief mourning period, his anger when she refused, his threats about the consequences of her decision. She had dismissed them as a rejected suitor's spite. Could he have actually pursued vengeance across a continent? "This is absurd," Rebecca interjected. "You're suggesting that a Boston businessman arranged for an entire wagon train to be attacked to, what, force Sarah's return, kill her and the children? It's unthinkable." "I agree, it seems extreme," James acknowledged, "but the Colonel has requested information about this man from authorities in Boston. Until we know more, he suggested increased caution." Sarah clutched the bundle of recovered documents against her chest, thoughts whirling. If there was any truth to this theory, her presence at the Mitchell homestead might be placing Rebecca at risk as well. "I should return to the settlement," she said suddenly. "If there's danger..." "Nonsense," Rebecca interrupted with surprising firmness. "This is speculation based on disturbed wagon positions, nothing more." She turned to James, her expression hard. "You've delivered your message, Mr. Walker. I suggest you rejoin the Colonel's party now." James accepted the dismissal with dignity, replacing his hat. "The Colonel asked me to remain in the territory until this matter is clarified. If you notice anything unusual, riders watching the property, strangers asking questions, send Daniel to the fort immediately." Rebecca's mouth tightened at this evidence of continued connection between James and their household, but she nodded curtly. "We're quite capable of watching for ourselves, but the Colonel's concern is noted." James turned to Sarah, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "The papers should be kept safe. If they were what the attackers sought, they might still hold value to whoever arranged the attack." Sarah nodded, understanding the warning beneath his words. "I'll be careful." Their eyes held for a moment longer than strictly proper, a connection that transcended the formalities surrounding them. Then James mounted his horse, tipped his hat once more, and rode away without further comment. When he had gone, Rebecca turned to Sarah, her expression troubled. You don't truly believe this fantasy about targeted attacks? That your husband's former partner would murder 15 families to reach you? Sarah stared at the retreating figure of James Walker, considering. Harold Winters was a possessive, controlling man. When Thomas was alive, he masked it well. After his death, when he believed I would naturally turn to him for protection, his true nature emerged. When I refused his proposal and announced my intention to join you in the territory, he threatened to make me regret my foolishness. Men make threats in anger, Rebecca said dismissively. It rarely signifies actual intent. Perhaps, Sarah conceded, but I would rather be cautious than careless, especially where the twins are concerned. Rebecca's expression softened at the mention of the children. On that we agree. But I maintain that Walker's theory is far-fetched at best, irresponsible at worst, frightening a woman who has already endured so much. Sarah held the bundle of recovered documents tighter. He wasn't trying to frighten me. He was trying to warn me. The distinction hung between them as they returned to the house, the day's ordinary tasks suddenly shadowed by extraordinary concerns. Sarah secluded herself in her room, carefully unwrapping the oilcloth to examine its contents, letters from her parents, a small wooden box containing her mother's locket and Thomas's cufflinks, and most precious of all, the official documents. Recording Emma and Ethan's birth, their father's name clearly stated, his signature affixed beside the doctor's. These papers represented their future, their security, their rightful place in the world. If someone had truly attacked the wagon, trains seeking to destroy them, or to destroy the twins' claim to their father's name, then the danger was far from past. They had merely exchanged one wilderness for another, one cave for a different kind of shelter. That evening, as she rocked the twins to sleep, Sarah found herself listening more intently to the night sounds beyond the cabin walls, the creak of settling timbers, the distant howl of wolves, the occasional snapping of frost-brittle branches. Every noise seemed suddenly ominous, potentially significant. Rebecca noticed her tension during the evening Bible reading, pausing in her recitation of Psalms to ask, "Are you unwell? You seem distracted." Sarah forced a smile. "Just tired. It's been an eventful day." Rebecca studied her with shrewd eyes. "Walker's visit upset you, his wild theories about the attack being targeted." "Not upset," Sarah corrected. "Concerned, cautious." "There's no safer place in the territory than this homestead," Rebecca assured her. "James, my husband, built it with defense in mind. 20 men could hold it against 100 attackers." The assertion was meant to comfort, but Sarah found it had the opposite effect. Rebecca was thinking in terms of Indian attacks, the frontier's most common danger. If Harold Winters had truly orchestrated the wagon train massacre, he would not send warriors with bows and arrows, but experienced killers who might approach under the guise of friendly visitors. "Tezanse, I'm sure you're right," she said aloud, unwilling to argue the point, "but I think I'll clean Thomas's revolver tomorrow just in case. It was among my recovered items." Rebecca raised an eyebrow but made no comment, returning to her reading. Later, as they prepared for bed, she paused at Sarah's door. "I've been thinking about Walker's theories." Sarah looked up from brushing her hair. "Yes? If, and I stress if, there's any truth to them, then perhaps your attendance at the burial service isn't wise. The settlement will be gathered in one place, attention focused on the ceremony, a vulnerable moment." The suggestion took Sarah by surprise. "You think I shouldn't pay respect to those who died? I think your children's safety might take precedence over social obligation," Rebecca replied, "just this once." The concern seemed genuine, even if Sarah suspected it was equally motivated by a desire to limit her interactions with James Walker at the public ceremony. Still, the warning deserved consideration. "I'll think on it," she promised. "Thank you for your concern." When Rebecca had gone, Sarah moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape, its contours softened by lingering snow. Somewhere out there, James Walker rode back to join the expedition, carrying her thanks and perhaps her unspoken trust. He had brought her Thomas's watch, her important papers, and a warning that others might have dismissed as irrelevant. He had seen her, truly seen her, in both desperation and dignity, and despite Rebecca's disapproval, despite the settlement's prejudice, he continued to extend protection, even from a distance. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting to know someone beyond these walls cared for her family's safety. Unsettling to recognize how quickly James Walker had become significant to her, a touchstone in this unfamiliar world. She thought of Harold Winters, his cold eyes and controlled smile masking ambition and entitlement. Was he truly capable of such calculated violence? Or was the attack simply the random tragedy it appeared? A moment of being in the wrong place, at the wrong time? Sarah had no answers, only questions that circled like wolves in the darkness. But as she closed the curtains and turned toward her sleeping children, one certainty remained. She had survived the wilderness once through instinct and determination. If necessary, she would do so again. The next 2 days passed in a heightened state of vigilance. Rebecca instructed Daniel to ride the property boundaries twice daily, watching for unfamiliar tracks or signs of observers. Mary was told to hang laundry inside, away from exposed sight lines. The doors were locked at sundown, an unusual precaution in frontier households where neighbors might arrive seeking help at any hour. Sarah said nothing about these measures, recognizing them as Rebecca's way of taking the warning seriously despite her stated skepticism. She focused on the twins, on household tasks, on the careful rebuilding of life after catastrophe. But her mind remained alert, calculating, preparing for contingencies she hoped never to face. The morning of the burial service dawned clear and cold. Sarah, dressed in the black mourning dress, now familiar after multiple wearings, and prepared the twins in their best clothes. The small bundle of recovered documents remained secure in her room, hidden between the mattress and bed frame where casual searchers would not think to look. Rebecca appeared in the doorway as Sarah pinned her hair, watching her preparations with poorly concealed concern. "Have you decided then? About attending?" "I have," Sarah replied, securing the final pin. "We will go. These people traveled with us, shared our journey. My children and I owe them this final respect." Rebecca sighed, but did not argue. "Very well. Daniel has the wagon ready, but we will stay together at all times and leave immediately after the service concludes." The journey to Pine Valley was tense, both women scanning the trail and surrounding forest with wary eyes. The twins, sensing the atmosphere, remained unusually quiet in Sarah's lap, their small faces solemn, as if understanding the day's significance. The settlement had transformed in preparation for the ceremony. Black ribbons hung from doorways, the small church's bell tolled at measured intervals, and the entire population appeared to have gathered at the cemetery where 15 new graves had been dug, symbolic resting places for the partial remains recovered from the massacre site. Colonel Hayes greeted them as they arrived, his formal uniform lending gravity to the occasion. Mrs. Mitchell," he acknowledged. "A somber day, but necessary for closure. For the community and for you especially, Mrs. Sarah." Sarah nodded, scanning the gathering for James's tall figure. She located him standing near the expedition members, dressed again in his formal clothes, his expression solemn. Their eyes met briefly across the crowd, before Rebecca steered her firmly toward the front rows, where the minister waited to begin the service. The ceremony was simple but moving. Prayers offered, names read aloud, brief stories shared of the families lost. Sarah sat straight-backed through it all, the twins remarkably quiet in her arms, as if they too felt the weight of memory and survival. When the minister invited her to speak, she hesitated only briefly before passing Emma to Rebecca and walking to stand beside the row of symbolic graves. Looking out at the gathered faces, some sympathetic, some curious, some still. Carrying the shadow of unspoken judgment, she spoke clearly and directly. These people were strangers to me when our journey began. By its end, they had become companions in hope, in hardship, in the shared dream of new beginnings. They did not deserve the fate that found them. She paused, gathering herself. I survived. By chance, by desperation, and by the skill of those sent to find us. I will honor their memory by living the life they sought, one of purpose, of community, of moving forward despite loss. As she returned to her seat, she caught James watching her, approval evident in his expression. It strengthened her somehow. This silent acknowledgement from the one person who truly understood what she had endured. The service concluded with the symbolic lowering of empty coffins, the community filing past to place flowers on the fresh-turned earth. As Sarah took her turn, Colonel Hayes approached, drawing her slightly aside. "A word, if I may," he said quietly. "I've had preliminary reports from Boston regarding your husband's former partner. Nothing conclusive but concerning. The man appears to have connections beyond legitimate business. Shipping interests with questionable cargo, associates with criminal backgrounds." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "You believe he could have arranged the attack?" "I believe. It's a possibility we cannot dismiss," Hayes replied grimly. "I've requested more information, but Frontier Communications being what they are, it could be weeks before we have confirmation." "What should I do in the meantime?" Sarah asked, acutely aware of Rebecca watching their conversation with evident suspicion. "Stay vigilant, keep to the homestead when possible, and," he hesitated, "accept that Walker's presence in the area may be your best protection. He knows this territory better than anyone, recognizes threats before they materialize." Sarah nodded, understanding the colonel's meaning. James Walker might be socially unacceptable in Rebecca's eyes, but his skills made him invaluable in matters of survival, a reality Hayes recognized, even if the settlement's residents preferred to ignore it. "Thank you for the warning," she said. "I'll be careful." As she rejoined Rebecca for the return journey, Sarah felt the weight of new knowledge pressing down. The attack that had claimed 15 families might not have been random violence, but calculated elimination, all to reach her, to silence her, perhaps to claim her children whose birth certificates named them rightful heirs to Thomas Mitchell's modest estate. The wilderness had taught her that survival sometimes required difficult choices, uncomfortable alliances, the setting aside of societal norms in favor of stark necessity. If danger truly followed her still, she would need to remember those lessons, even if they placed her at odds with Rebecca's careful propriety. For the wilderness didn't end at the settlement's boundaries or the homestead's fence line. It lived in human hearts as well, in ambition unconstrained by morality, in hatred disguised as business, in the ruthless pursuit of power and possession. And against that wilderness, Sarah would need every ally she could find, even those deemed unacceptable by the very civilization that claimed to protect her. The spring thaw came suddenly to Whispering Pines territory, turning packed snow to mud overnight, swelling creeks beyond their banks, and isolating the Mitchell homestead from Pine Valley for nearly a week. Sarah spent the enforced seclusion, watching the twins grow stronger daily, their personalities emerging like early flowers. Emma bold and curious, Ethan quieter but observant, his earlier weakness giving way to steady resilience. Rebecca maintained her customary routines despite the isolation, perhaps finding comfort in their predictability. Bible readings morning and evening, meticulous housekeeping, careful inventory of supplies. But Sarah noticed a new vigilance in her sister-in-law, evident in the rifle kept loaded by the door, in her insistence that Daniel patrol the property perimeter twice daily regardless of weather. The Colonel's warning about Harold Winters had affected Rebecca more than she cared to admit. Each day brought small adjustments to the homestead security, new locks fashioned for outbuildings, a system of signals established with Daniel's family on the neighboring property, provisions stockpiled as if preparing for siege. Sarah said nothing about these preparations, recognizing them as necessary precautions rather than excessive fears. Instead, she contributed in practical ways, cleaning and loading Thomas's revolver, which she kept in her room, teaching Mary which herbs in Rebecca's garden had medicinal properties, practicing carrying both twins simultaneously for quick movement if needed. They were preparing breakfast when Daniel arrived, mud-splattered and breathless, having pushed his horse hard through the still treacherous trails. "Riders coming," he announced without preamble. "Military escort from the fort, 3 men, plus Walker." Sarah's heart quickened at the mention of James, whom she hadn't seen since the burial service nearly 2 weeks earlier. Rebecca's expression tightened momentarily before smoothing into practical concern. "Did they state their business?" she asked, already reaching for additional coffee cups. Daniel shook his head. "Just that Colonel Hayes sent them with urgent news. They're about 20 minutes behind me." Rebecca nodded briskly. "Mary, prepare more breakfast. Sarah, check that the twins are presentable. Daniel, see to the horses when they arrive." The small flurry of activity gave Sarah cover for her racing thoughts. Urgent news could only concern the investigation into Harold Winters, into the possibility that the wagon train massacre had been orchestrated rather than random. And James's presence with the military escort suggested the matter was serious indeed. She changed the twins quickly into clean clothes, her movements efficient but gentle. As she worked, she found herself pausing to study their faces, Thomas's chin in Emma, his eyes in Ethan, the Mitchell family resemblance that Rebecca had noted upon first meeting them. These children were the last of their father's line, the inheritors of whatever modest legacy he had left behind. If Harold Winters had truly orchestrated violence to eliminate them, to erase their claim and their existence, what wouldn't he do to complete that mission? By the time Sarah returned to the main room with the twins, the riders had arrived. 2 soldiers in fort uniforms stood awkwardly near the door, removing hats and stamping mud from boots. A 3rd man, older, with the insignia of a military physician, conversed quietly with Rebecca, and by the window, slightly apart as always, stood James Walker. His appearance struck Sarah anew, tall and straight-backed, his mixed heritage evident in the high cheekbones and copper skin, in the straight black hair, now tied at his nape with a leather cord. He wore frontier clothes rather than his formal attire from the burial service, buckskins, sturdy boots, a knife at his belt, trail clothes, traveling clothes. Their eyes met across the room, his expression warming briefly before resuming its careful neutrality. Rebecca, noticing the exchange, smoothly positioned herself between them as she made introductions. "My sister-in-law, Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, and her children, Emma and Ethan," she told the military physician. "Sarah, this is Dr. Morgan from Fort Harrison." "Ma'am," Morgan greeted, his voice grave, "Colonel Hayes sends his respects. We have news that couldn't wait for improved trail conditions." Sarah nodded, settling into a chair with the twins in her lap. "Please, what have you learned?" Dr. Morgan exchanged glances with the soldiers, then with James, before answering. "The Colonel received confirmation from Boston authorities regarding your husband's former business partner. Harold Winters departed Boston 3 weeks after you left for the territory. He was ostensibly traveling to Chicago on business, but never arrived there. Instead, it appears he journeyed west, his movements becoming more difficult to trace as he left established routes. Rebecca sank into a chair opposite Sarah, her normally composed features showing genuine alarm. "You believe he personally arranged the attack on the wagon train?" "We believe he hired men to do so," Morgan confirmed. "Men with experience in frontier violence who could make an attack appear to be the work of native raiders. The Boston authorities report that Winters made several large withdrawals before departing. Enough money to hire such men and ensure their silence afterward." Sarah clutched the twins closer, a cold certainty settling in her chest. "He meant to eliminate us completely, to erase any claim the children might have to Thomas's estate." James spoke for the first time, his deep voice drawing all eyes. "The pattern of the attack supports this theory. The last wagon targeted was yours, Mrs. Mitchell, and it was searched thoroughly before being burned, suggesting they were looking for documents, not valuables." "The birth certificates," Sarah whispered, "the marriage license, proof of the twins' legitimacy." Dr. Morgan nodded grimly. "Precisely. Without those documents, and with no witnesses to your marriage or the children's parentage, Winters could potentially claim the entire Mitchell estate as Thomas's business partner. A considerable sum, by all accounts." Rebecca's practical mind moved immediately to the present danger. "You believe this man, or his hired killers, might still be seeking Sarah and the children?" "We consider it likely," Morgan confirmed, "especially since the documents he sought to destroy were recovered from the wagon train site. As long as those papers exist, his claim to the Mitchell estate remains contestable." Sarah thought of the precious papers hidden between her mattress and bed frame, the twins' birth certificates with Thomas's signature, their marriage license, the letter from Thomas's attorney confirming the children's inheritance should both parents die. Small pieces of paper that had suddenly become worth killing for. "What does Colonel Hayes suggest?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Dr. Morgan hesitated, glancing again at James before answering. "The Colonel believes the Mitchell homestead may no longer be safe. If Winters has indeed followed Sarah west, it's only a matter of time before he discovers her location. The territory has too many eyes, too many willing to share information for the right price." "Are you suggesting we abandon our home?" Rebecca asked incredulously. "Temporarily," Morgan clarified, "until Winters can be apprehended. The Colonel has authorized a safe location, a hunting cabin used by the fort for special operations, remote, defensible, and known to very few. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear, a location known to James Walker, who would presumably guide them there." Rebecca's expression hardened as she grasped this reality. "Surely the fort itself would provide better protection," she argued. "Or even the settlement, where neighbors could assist." Morgan shook his head. "The fort has too many civilian workers coming and going, impossible to control information. And the settlement is the first place Winters will look once he reaches. The territory. No, the Colonel is adamant that a remote location unknown to outsiders offers the best chance for Mrs. Sarah's safety." Rebecca turned to Sarah, her eyes communicating volumes. Concern, disapproval, a silent warning about what this plan would mean. Isolation in the wilderness, with James Walker as their guide and protector. A violation of every social convention she held dear. But Sarah was already calculating practicalities. What supplies the twins would need, how long they might be away, whether Emma's recent cough would withstand the journey. The prospect of flight didn't frighten her, as it might have months ago. She had already fled once with her children, had already survived wilderness conditions with nothing but determination and chance. "When would we leave?" she asked, directing the question to Dr. Morgan rather than James, though she felt his gaze upon her. "Immediately," Morgan replied. "Today. The Colonel fears Winters may already be closer than we know." Rebecca stood abruptly. "This is absurd. To abandon a secure homestead on the word of Boston authorities who have never set foot in this territory. To entrust my sister-in-law and her children to... She caught herself, glancing at James. To wilderness conditions, when they've only just recovered from their ordeal. Rebecca, Sarah said quietly, if there's even a possibility that Harold Winters orchestrated the massacre, we must take the Colonel's warning seriously. You've seen the measures he's taken, sending armed escorts through difficult conditions to deliver this news personally. Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. At least allow me to accompany you. The children need familiar care, consistency. The homestead needs you more, Sarah interrupted gently. If we both leave, it signals to anyone watching that something has changed. Better for you to maintain normal routines, give the appearance that nothing is amiss. The logic was sound, but Sarah could see that it did little to ease Rebecca's distress, not just concern for their safety, but genuine apprehension about Sarah and the twins being alone with James Walker, about what such an arrangement would mean for their reputation, their standing in the community. Dr. Morgan cleared his throat. Mrs. Mitchell is correct. Maintaining normal appearances at the homestead may buy valuable time for the Colonel's men to intercept Winters before he can act. Rebecca turned to James, addressing him directly for perhaps the first time since his arrival. And you, Mr. Walker? You've been remarkably silent about this plan that places my sister-in-law and her children under your sole protection. James met her gaze steadily. The Colonel believes I'm the best choice for this assignment because I know the territory, because I can move without being tracked, and because I've already demonstrated willingness to protect Mrs. Sarah and her children, at risk to myself. His voice remained even, respectful, but with an underlying firmness. I will guard them with my life if necessary. Beyond that, I can offer no assurances that would satisfy your concerns. The honesty of this response seemed to give Rebecca pause. For all her prejudice against his heritage, she recognized the truth in his words. He had indeed saved Sarah once before, had demonstrated skill and honor when it mattered most. She turned back to Sarah. You trust this plan? This man? Sarah looked directly at James, considering. Not just his abilities as a tracker and guide, but his character, the care with which he had approached her at the cave, the respect he had shown during their journey to safety, the dignity with which he endured the settlement's prejudice. When she answered, her voice held certainty. Yes, with my children's lives. Something passed between them in that moment. An acknowledgement, a promise, a connection forged in shared understanding of what was truly at stake. Rebecca observed this silent exchange with troubled eyes, but made no further protest. Very well, she said finally. What preparations are needed? The next hour passed in controlled chaos. Food packed, clothing gathered, supplies assembled. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, having learned from her previous flight what was truly essential. The soldiers assisted, loading provisions onto pack horses, securing the specialized equipment Dr. Morgan had brought for the twins' comfort during the journey. Rebecca worked alongside them, her initial resistance giving way to practical assistance, though Sarah caught her watching James with lingering suspicion whenever he entered the house to collect prepared supplies. For his part, James maintained a respectful distance, coordinating with the soldiers outside, checking and double-checking the horses, studying maps with Dr. Morgan. When all was nearly ready, Rebecca took Sarah aside in the bedroom, pressing a small Bible into her hands. Take this, she said, her voice low and urgent. Read it daily. Remember who you are, what is expected of you. Sarah understood the gift's dual nature, both spiritual comfort and pointed reminder of propriety, of the social boundaries Rebecca feared might blur during their isolation in the wilderness. I'll bring them back safely, Sarah promised, and intact in every way that matters. Rebecca's eyes filled unexpectedly. "I've grown fond of them," she admitted. "Of you as well, though I've been poor at showing it. This house has been too quiet since James died. Having children here again." She didn't finish the thought. Sarah impulsively embraced her, this stern woman who had offered shelter when they had nothing, who had maintained appearances while secretly reinforcing the homestead's defenses, whose rigid propriety masked genuine concern. "We'll return," she promised. "And when this danger has passed, we'll make a proper home here, as families should." Rebecca nodded, composing herself quickly as a soldier appeared at the doorway to announce that all was ready. Sarah gathered the twins, now dressed in their warmest clothes despite the spring thaw, and followed Rebecca to the yard where the horses waited. James stood holding the reins of a sturdy mare, specially outfitted with a modified saddlebag designed to securely hold the twins. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted formally, handing the reins to a soldier while he helped Sarah mount. The process of securing the twins in their specialized carrier took several minutes, during which Sarah was acutely aware of Rebecca watching, of the soldier's careful averting of eyes, of James's quiet competence as he checked and rechecked the safety straps. "They'll be secure," he assured her, his hand briefly touching Emma's head as the child gurgled curiously at him. "But we'll stop regularly to let them stretch and feed." Dr. Morgan approached, offering final instructions. "The cabin is provisioned with basic medical supplies, but I've included additional items for the children: fever powder, soothing syrup for teething pain, salve for rashes. The Colonel will send updates when possible, though communication will necessarily be limited to maintain secrecy." Sarah nodded, adjusting her cloak against the morning chill. "Please thank Colonel Hayes for his protection and assure him we'll follow Mr. Walker's guidance exactly." Morgan tipped his hat, mounting his own horse. "We'll ride with you to the forest edge, then return to report to the Colonel. From there, Walker knows the safest route." Rebecca approached for a final farewell, her composure regained, though her eyes remained troubled. "Be vigilant," she said, reaching up to grasp Sarah's hand. "And remember all I've said." "I will," Sarah promised. "Take care of yourself as well. If winter should appear at the homestead, I'll manage," Rebecca interrupted with unexpected steel. "This isn't the first time this homestead has faced danger." With final words of parting, the small party moved out, Dr. Morgan leading, flanked by the two soldiers, Sarah riding behind with the twins secured before her, and James bringing up the rear, alert and watchful. As they crested the small rise beyond the homestead's boundaries, Sarah glanced back to see Rebecca, standing straight and solitary before the house, a diminishing figure against the vast landscape. The journey began easily enough, following established trails through budding forest and across meadows where early wildflowers pushed through melting snow patches. The twins, lulled by the horses' steady movement, dozed contentedly in their carrier, waking only when the party stopped to rest the animals and allow Sarah to nurse them. At midday, they reached the edge of charted territory. Dr. Morgan reined in, gesturing to the dense forest beyond. "This is where we part ways, Mrs. Mitchell. From here, the route is known only to Walker, deliberately so, for your protection." Sarah nodded, understanding the strategy. If captured or questioned, even the soldiers and the doctor could not reveal her destination because they genuinely didn't know it. "Thank you for your escort," she said formally. "Please assure the Colonel we're in good hands." Morgan glanced at James, an unspoken communication passing between them. "Walker knows the rendezvous points for updates. The Colonel hopes to have Winters in custody within 2 weeks. Until then, trust no one who approaches, regardless of their story." With formal salutes, the military party turned back toward the fort, leaving Sarah alone with James and the twins at the forest's edge. A moment of silence stretched between them, The first time they had been truly alone since those desperate days after the massacre. "The trail gets rougher from here," James said finally, adjusting his horse's girth strap. "We'll need to move at a slower pace, more carefully. The cabin is about 4 hours ahead, if the streams haven't risen too high." Sarah nodded, checking the twins who had woken and were watching the forest canopy with wide, curious eyes. "Lead on, Mr. Walker, we'll manage." He studied her for a moment, as if reassessing his impression of her strength, her capability. "James," he said finally, "out here, formality serves no purpose." She hesitated, weighing Rebecca's warnings against the practical reality of their situation. "James," she agreed quietly, "and I'm Sarah." He nodded once, satisfaction flickering briefly across his features before his attention returned to their surroundings. "Stay close. The trail is faint in places." The forest closed around them, like a living entity, ancient pines and flowering dogwoods creating a canopy that dappled sunlight across the narrow game trail James followed. Unlike their desperate flight after the massacre, this journey had purpose, direction, the comfort of supplies and planning. Yet Sarah found herself equally alert, equally aware of each sound, each movement in the underbrush. James rode slightly ahead, occasionally raising a hand to indicate caution at a difficult section of trail. He spoke little, conserving energy for observation, but Sarah found his silence companionable rather than awkward. They moved together with the synchronized awareness of those who had already faced danger as a unit, who understood each other's rhythms without needless words. The twins, far from being distressed by the journey, seemed to relish the sensory experience. The shifting patterns of light and shadow, the varied forest sounds, the gentle motion of the horse beneath them. Emma, in particular, watched James with undisguised fascination whenever he came into her line of sight, her small face tracking his movements with remarkable focus for an infant. They crossed 3 streams, each swollen with snowmelt, James dismounting to lead Sarah's horse carefully through the swift currents. At the 3rd crossing, Emma reached out impulsively as James helped them to the opposite bank, tiny fingers grasping at his buckskin sleeve. He paused, surprised, then offered his finger, for her to grip instead, a small smile softening his usually guarded features. "She's strong," he observed, as Emma maintained her hold with determined focus. "Like her father," Sarah replied, the words coming naturally despite the pang they brought. "Thomas had remarkable hands, could fix the most delicate clockwork, yet split logs with ease." James nodded, gently disengaging as Emma finally released him. Children carry their parents with them, in ways beyond blood. The observation, simple yet profound, reminded Sarah how little she knew of James's own history. "Your parents, are they still living?" He remounted, adjusting his hat against the afternoon sun. "My mother died 2 winters ago. Fever. My father, before that hunting accident when I was 15. "I'm sorry," Sarah offered, genuine in her sympathy. James shrugged slightly. "It's the way of things out here. Few die old in their beds." He glanced at the twins. "But those who survive grow strong, resilient. Like you," Sarah thought but didn't say. Like Emma and Ethan might become, shaped by this wilderness and the challenges it presented. Perhaps that was what Rebecca feared most, not just impropriety or scandal, but the territory's influence itself, its indifference to social constraints, its rewarding of practical skills over proper manners. The trail narrowed as they climbed higher, the forest giving way to rocky outcroppings that afforded occasional views of the valley below. In late afternoon, as shadows lengthened and the twins began showing signs of hunger and fatigue, James reined in at a particular bend in the trail. "We're close now," he said, dismounting to adjust a stone marker half hidden by new growth. "The cabin is just beyond that ridge." Last stretch is steeper. Might be easier if I carry one of the little ones. Sarah hesitated only briefly before unhooking the carrier's safety straps. Ethan, perhaps. He's been fussing for the past mile. James reached up, his movements careful but confident as he lifted the boy from the carrier. Ethan stilled immediately, startled by the change in handlers, then relaxed against James's chest, tiny hands pressing against the unfamiliar buckskin shirt with evident curiosity. "He remembers you?" Sarah observed, surprised. "From when you carried him during our first journey?" James glanced down at the child in his arms, something indefinable crossing his features. Maybe, or maybe he just knows when he's safe. The simple statement carried weight beyond its words, an acknowledgement of trust, placed and honored, of responsibility accepted without reservation. Sarah felt a curious warmth spread through her chest, watching this man who straddled two worlds cradle her son with natural ease, with unquestioning protection. They continued up the trail, Sarah following James's lead through increasingly rugged terrain. Finally, as the sun dipped toward the western peaks, a small clearing appeared, and within it, a cabin built into the hillside itself, half hidden by strategic placement and natural camouflage. "The Colonel's Special Operations location," James explained, leading them toward it. "Used for observation missions, treaty meetings with tribes who prefer neutrality, occasional refuge for informants or witnesses." The structure was more substantial than Sarah had expected, solidly built of pine logs with a stone chimney, windows shuttered from within, a small corral for horses attached to one side. The surrounding clearing had been designed for defense. Open space, providing clear sight lines in all directions, multiple escape routes visible only to the initiated, natural features incorporated as barriers and blinds. "It's perfect," Sarah said, dismounting carefully with Emma still secured against her. "Invisible, unless you know exactly where to look." James nodded, satisfaction evident, as he shifted Ethan to one arm and reached for a key hidden in a crevice beside the door. "That's the idea. Even most of the fort's personnel don't know it exists." The interior was simple but comfortable. A main room with fireplace, table and chairs. A small bedroom visible through an open doorway. Basic furnishings, crafted for utility rather than beauty. Everything needed for extended shelter without unnecessary luxuries. "The Colonel had supplies brought in yesterday," James explained, gesturing to stocked shelves and a wood box filled with split logs. "Food, medicine, fuel. Enough for a few weeks if necessary." Sarah stepped inside, taking in their temporary refuge with a practical eye. Not the Mitchell homestead, with its rigid order and biblical samplers, but a space designed solely for survival, for protection, for waiting out danger until safety could be restored. "It will serve," she said simply, moving to unfasten Emma from her travel wrappings. "Thank you for bringing us here." James set Ethan down carefully on a bearskin rug before the fireplace, the child immediately reaching for the unfamiliar texture with curious fingers. "I'll see to the horses. Bring in our supplies. There's a spring behind the cabin for fresh water." As he stepped outside, Sarah took a moment to simply breathe, to acknowledge the strange turn her life had taken, from Boston widow to wagon train survivor to fugitive, hidden in a secret military cabin, all within the span of months. The twins, resilient as always, had already begun exploring their new surroundings, their exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the excitement of discovery. Through the window, Sarah watched James unsaddling the horses, his movements efficient and practiced. This man, who had rescued her twice now, first from the wilderness itself, now from human predators who believed her children's lives worth less than property and inheritance. This man whom Rebecca and the settlement viewed with suspicion and judgment, yet whom Colonel Hayes trusted with the most sensitive of missions. This man, whom Sarah had entrusted with her children's lives without hesitation or reservation. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared above the mountain ridge, Sarah prepared a simple meal from the provisions, while James built a fire in the stone hearth. The twins, fed and changed, lay on a blanket nearby, their small faces illuminated by firelight as they fought sleep with diminishing success. "They should rest well tonight," James observed, arranging logs for slow, even burning. "Journey tired them properly," Sarah nodded, stirring a pot of bean stew hanging from the iron crane. "They're stronger than they appear. Survivors, like their mother." James glanced up, firelight casting his features into sharp relief. "Like their mother," he agreed quietly. "Few would have managed what you did in that cave, keeping 2 infants alive for days with almost nothing." The simple acknowledgement of what she had endured, of the desperate measures she had taken to keep her children breathing, struck Sarah deeply. Rebecca had never truly asked about those days, had seemed to prefer not knowing the details of their survival. But James had been there, had seen the cave, had understood immediately what her hollow eyes and trembling hands had meant. "I did what any mother would," she said, though they both knew this wasn't entirely true. Many would have surrendered to despair, to the seeming inevitability of death in that stone prison. "Not any mother," James contradicted gently. "A specific mother with specific courage." The compliment, delivered without flattery or expectation, warmed Sarah more than the fire. She served the simple meal in wooden bowls, the 2 of them sitting at the rough-hewn table while the twins finally surrendered to sleep on their blanket. "The Colonel believes 2 weeks may be enough to locate Winters," James said, between careful spoonfuls of the hot stew. "But we should prepare for longer if necessary." Sarah nodded, her thoughts turning practical. "The supplies seem adequate. And you mentioned a spring for water. Is there game nearby if needed?" "Deer, rabbit, wild turkey. Fish in the stream below. We won't go hungry." He studied her over his bowl. "You're not afraid of extended isolation? Many would be." Sarah considered the question seriously. "After the cave, very little frightens me in the same way. Being alone, being lost, watching my children weaken day by day, that was terror beyond naming." She glanced at the sleeping twins. This is merely inconvenience by comparison." James's expression shifted to something like admiration. Though he said nothing, returning his attention to his meal, they ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling, the spring wind occasionally rattling the shutters, the twins breathing softly in perfect synchronization. As Sarah cleared away the simple dishes, James unrolled his bedding near the door, positioning himself deliberately between potential danger and his charges. The gesture, practical yet deeply symbolic, did not escape Sarah's notice. "The bedroom has a proper bed," she offered, feeling suddenly awkward about sleeping arrangements. "The twins and I can manage on pallets out here if you'd prefer." "No," he interrupted firmly. "You take the bedroom with the little ones. I'm accustomed to sleeping rough, and I'll hear better from here if anyone approaches in the night." The arrangement made practical sense, yet Sarah knew Rebecca would have been scandalized by its implications. A single woman and an unmarried man, regardless of circumstances or intentions, sharing shelter without chaperone or witness. The frontier's necessities versus civilization's proprieties clashing yet again. "As you think best," she conceded, gathering the sleeping twins carefully. "Good night then, and thank you, James, for everything." He nodded, something unspoken passing between them. Acknowledgement of boundaries maintained, of trust extended, of shared purpose transcending social constraints. "Sleep well, Sarah," he replied, the use of her given name still new and unfamiliar between them. "I'll keep watch." In the small bedroom, Sarah settled the twins on the bed against the wall, arranging blankets to prevent them from rolling. The room was spare but clean. A single window shuttered against the night, a shelf holding a lamp, and the medical supplies Dr. Morgan had provided. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah found herself thinking of Rebecca, alone now at the homestead, maintaining appearances while undoubtedly worrying about them, about the propriety of their arrangement, about what the settlement might say if they knew. Her concern was genuine, her intentions protective. Yet Sarah couldn't help but compare the rigid boundaries of the homestead with the simple clarity of this cabin, where survival and protection outweighed social consideration, where trust was based on demonstrated character rather than acceptable background. Through the partially open door, she could see James's silhouette as he checked the shutters one final time, as he added another log to the fire, as he settled on his bedroll with the ease of a man accustomed to making any place his temporary home. Not conventionally handsome by Eastern standards perhaps, but striking in his way. The strong profile, the quiet confidence, the skill that moved with him like a second skin. A dangerous line of thinking, Sarah acknowledged, closing the bedroom door firmly against such observations. Rebecca's warnings echoed in her mind, about reputation, about the twins' future, about maintaining proper distinctions despite wilderness conditions. Yet as she slipped into the simple bed beside her sleeping children, Sarah found herself wondering which posed the greater danger to her carefully reconstructed life. Harold Winters, with his murderous ambition, or James Walker, with his quiet strength and unflinching honor. One threatened her very existence, the other threatened the social boundaries that defined acceptable existence. And somewhere in the darkness, between those threats lay the truth Sarah wasn't yet ready to fully acknowledge, that the wilderness had changed her in ways that civilized society might never understand or accept. That survival had taught her to value substance over appearance, demonstrated character over social standing, genuine protection over proper distance. That in this remote cabin, hidden from both danger and judgment, she might be forced to confront not just Winters's threat to her life, but the territory's threat to her understanding of what life could be. 3 days passed in the mountain cabin, settling into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Sarah cared for the twins, prepared simple meals, and organized their limited supplies with efficient precision. James maintained their security, checking the perimeter at dawn and dusk, hunting fresh meat to supplement their provisions, teaching Sarah discreet signals and escape routes should they be needed. The twins thrived in this simplified environment, their world narrowed to the cabin and small clearing. Emma particularly seemed to blossom, crawling with newfound determination across the wooden floor, pulling herself up against chair legs, watching James with undisguised fascination whenever he entered the cabin. Ethan remained more cautious, but observed everything with keen intelligence, his earlier frailty now just a memory. On the 4th morning, Sarah woke to find James already gone, his bedroll neatly packed beside the door. The fire had been built up against the morning chill, fresh water brought in from the spring. These quiet courtesies had become routine, his way of providing care while maintaining proper distance. The twins still slept, curled together like matched bookends. Sarah took advantage of the rare solitude to step outside, breathing deeply of pine-scented air. Mist hung in the valley below, dawn light turning it gold-tinged and magical. After so much fear and chaos, this moment of beauty felt almost startling in its ordinary perfection. She heard James before she saw him. Quiet footsteps approaching from the tree line, deliberate noise to announce his presence. He emerged carrying 2 rabbits, freshly dressed for cooking. "Good morning," he greeted, keeping his voice low to avoid waking the twins inside. "Sleep well?" Sarah nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "Better than I would have expected, given the circumstances. You?" "Well enough." He deposited the rabbits on the small preparation table beside the cabin. The rendezvous with the Colonel's messenger is today, should bring news of Winters. Sarah's momentary peace evaporated at the reminder of why they were here, of the man who had orchestrated the deaths of 15 families to reach her and her children. What time? Noon. Ridge Point, about a mile east. James studied her face, reading her renewed anxiety. You and the twins will stay here, safer. Of course. She hesitated, then asked the question that had lingered since their arrival. James, what happens if they can't find him? If Winters simply vanishes into the territory? He considered this seriously, never offering false reassurance. Then decisions will need to be made about your future, the twins' future, whether to return to the Mitchell homestead or seek safety elsewhere. Leave the territory entirely. You mean, Sarah clarified, the possibility both daunting and disheartening, to flee again, to rebuild again, to explain to Rebecca why her sister-in-law and the last Mitchell heirs must abandon their rightful home. James nodded, his expression grave. It would be one option, though not necessarily the best one. What would be better? Living in constant fear, always watching for threats. The strain of recent weeks caught up with Sarah suddenly, her voice sharpening with suppressed emotion. My children deserve stability, security, a future without looking over their shoulders. Yes, James agreed quietly. They do. He moved closer, stopping at a respectful distance. But running isn't always the answer. Sometimes standing your ground is the only way to truly end a threat. Sarah studied him, this man who had never truly belonged anywhere yet defended territory with bone-deep commitment, who navigated between worlds with painful awareness of boundaries, who understood better than most the cost of always being on guard. You've never run, she observed. Despite how the settlement treats you, despite being caught between cultures. A slight smile touched his lips. I've considered it many times. But this land, he gestured to the vista before them, the mountains rising purple against dawn sky, the forests unfurling below. It has a way of claiming you, of becoming worth defending, regardless of those who would deny your right to it. The words struck Sarah deeply, resonating with her own emerging feelings. This wild territory with its dangers and its beauty, its harshness and its unexpected grace, it had become part of her children, in ways she hadn't anticipated. When she'd first embarked on the journey west, the twins were born for this place, she said softly. I see it in how they respond to it. Emma especially. She's stronger here, more herself somehow. James glanced toward the cabin where the infants still slept. Children recognize truth. Before adults do. They haven't learned to fear what's different, to judge what's unfamiliar. Like their mother is learning to do? Sarah asked with gentle self-mockery. His eyes returned to her, something warming in their depths. You adapted. Faster than most. Survival has a way of stripping away pretense. Before Sarah could respond, a soft cry from inside signaled that the twins were awake. The moment of connection broke as she turned toward maternal duties, James toward practical ones, their separate roles clearly defined despite the understanding that had briefly bridged them. The morning passed in routine tasks, feeding the twins, preparing rabbit stew for later, James checking and cleaning his rifle in preparation for the rendezvous. An air of anticipation hung over these ordinary activities, the knowledge that news was coming, that decisions might soon be forced. As noon approached, James prepared to depart for the meeting point. Bar the door behind me, he instructed, buckling his knife belt. Open only for my specific knock. 3 short, 1 long, 3 short. I should return before sunset, but if I'm delayed... I remember the emergency protocols, Sarah assured him. Down the back trail to the lightning-struck pine, then follow. The stream bed east to the secondary shelter. He nodded, satisfied. "You're a quick study." "I've had motivation," she replied simply, glancing at the twins who played on a blanket near the fire. James reached for his hat, then paused, his expression unusually hesitant. "Sarah, regardless of what news comes today, know that you have choices, more than might be immediately apparent." She tilted her head, trying to decipher his meaning. "What choices do you imagine I have if Winters remains at large? If we cannot return to the homestead?" "There are other homesteads, other territories." He adjusted his hat, not quite meeting her eyes. "Other arrangements that might provide safety and stability for the twins." The implications of this carefully worded statement hung in the air between them. Not a proposal, not quite, but an opening, a possibility laid before her with characteristic restraint. Before Sarah could formulate a response, a sound outside froze them both. Horse hooves on the trail, approaching fast. James moved to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the shutters. "Military uniform," he reported, tension evident in his posture. "Single rider. One of the colonel's men. By the look, but coming from the wrong direction for our arranged meeting." Sarah gathered the twins instinctively, holding them close as James unbarred the door, rifle ready, but not raised. Moments later, a soldier reined in before the cabin, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Walker!" he called urgently. "Message from Colonel Hayes." James stepped onto the porch, signaling Sarah to remain inside. "You're off course, Jenkins. Rendezvous point is East Ridge." "No time," Jenkins replied, dismounting hastily. "Winters has been spotted near Pine Valley with hired guns. They attacked a patrol last night, wounded 2 men. They're searching homesteads systematically." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Rebecca," she whispered, emerging despite James's warning gesture. "The Mitchell homestead." Jenkins turned to her, recognizing her from the settlement. "Mrs. Mitchell. The colonel sent men to warn your sister-in-law as soon as we realized Winters's pattern. But your homestead is third in the valley sequence if he's moving methodically." James was already gathering his gear, movements swift and economical. "How many men with Winters?" 4 confirmed, possibly more. Jenkins accepted the canteen James offered, drinking deeply. "Colonel's assembling a proper force, but they're hours behind me." James turned to Sarah, his decision already made. "I'm riding for the homestead, now. Jenkins will stay with you and the twins." "No," Sarah countered immediately. "I'm coming with you." "Sarah," James began, his tone sharp with concern. "Rebecca is alone, except for Daniel and Mary. She's in danger because of me, because of my children." Sarah's voice brooked no argument. "The twins will slow us down, yes, but the alternative is leaving them with a stranger, however well-intentioned." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Mitchell has a point, Walker, and 4 against 1, even with your skills. Those aren't odds I'd favor." James studied Sarah's determined expression, recognizing the same resolve that had kept her children alive in the cave, that had navigated the wilderness with dignity intact, that had endured prejudice and suspicion without surrendering principle. 20 minutes, he conceded finally. "Pack only what the twins absolutely need. Jenkins, check your ammunition, then help me prepare the horses." The journey back was punishing, far faster than their careful travel to the cabin, with no luxury of regular stops for the twins' comfort. They rode hard, Sarah's jaw clenched against the jarring impact, her arms aching from holding Emma and Ethan secure. James led, his focus absolute, pausing only when absolutely necessary to rest the horses or allow Sarah brief moments to tend the increasingly fretful twins. Jenkins brought up the rear, rifle across his saddle, constantly scanning for pursuit or ambush. "Walker," he called during one such brief stop. "We could cut through Blackwater Canyon, might save an hour." James shook his head definitively. "Too narrow. Perfect place for an ambush if Winters has scouts watching approaches to the homestead. But Rebecca, Sarah began, fear making her voice sharp. We do her no good if we're shot before arriving, James interrupted, his tone gentler than his words. Trust me, Sarah. Please. She subsided, recognizing the wisdom in his caution despite her desperate urgency. As they remounted, James reached over unexpectedly, his hand briefly covering hers where it gripped the reins. We'll reach her in time, he promised, the words carrying more weight for being offered by a man who never spoke with false certainty. The afternoon was waning when they finally crested the rise, overlooking the Mitchell homestead. From this distance, all appeared normal. Smoke rising from the chimney, chickens pecking in the yard, washing still hung on the line. But James signaled for them to halt, studying the scene with narrowed eyes. Something's wrong, he said quietly. Horses in the corral that aren't Rebecca's. And Daniel's rifle isn't by the chopping block where he always keeps it. Sarah strained to see these subtle indicators of trouble. Could they have visitors, neighbors? James shook his head. Neighbors would have hitched at the front, not corralled their mounts. He turned to Jenkins. Circle wide, approach from the back. If you see clear trouble, fire 1 shot. If it's safe, 2 shots. The soldier nodded, peeling away to follow. Orders? James turned to Sarah, his expression grave. You and the twins stay here until we know what we're facing. But please, he cut her off, voice soft but unyielding. If something happens to me, ride hard for Pine Valley. Don't stop. Don't look back. The Colonel's men will be coming this way. The stark reality of their situation struck Sarah anew. The very real possibility that James might not return from the homestead, that she might be left alone to protect her children from Winters and his men, that her decision to leave the cabins, safety might prove catastrophic. Be careful, she whispered, unconsciously echoing Rebecca's farewell days earlier. James nodded once, checking his rifle before slipping from his horse and disappearing into the tree line, moving with the silent efficiency that had first saved her in the wilderness. Minutes stretched like hours as Sarah waited, the twins mercifully, quiet as if sensing the gravity of the moment. She strained for any sound from the homestead below, voices, shots, anything to indicate what James might be facing. When the single rifle shot cracked the afternoon stillness, Sarah's heart seemed to stop. Not the all-clear signal of 2 shots, just one. Danger, trouble, a warning. She clutched the twins closer, mind racing. James's instructions had been clear. Ride for Pine Valley if trouble came, but Rebecca was down there, possibly injured or captured, and James too, now potentially in danger. Before she could decide, movement at the homestead's edge caught her. Attention! A figure emerged from the barn, moving with stealth toward the house. James, still alive, still fighting. Another figure appeared on the porch. A stranger, rifle raised, scanning the property. From this distance, Sarah couldn't make out features, couldn't tell if this might be Winters himself or one of his hired guns. She saw James freeze, press, himself against the house wall, calculating angles and approaches. The man on the porch stepped further out, revealing a second figure behind him. Rebecca, her posture rigid with fear or defiance, something pressed against her back that could only be a weapon. Sarah's breath caught. Her sister-in-law was alive, but clearly being used as leverage, as bait. For her, for James, for the twins. The why hardly mattered against the stark reality of Rebecca's danger. A third man emerged from the house, his bearing suggesting authority despite his frontier clothes. Even at this distance, something about his stance triggered recognition in Sarah. The precise way he held himself, the controlling hand on Rebecca's arm, the impatient gesture toward the barn where Jenkins must have been discovered. Harold Winters, the Boston businessman who had orchestrated a massacre to eliminate her children's claim to their rightful inheritance. The man who had pursued her across a continent out of greed and wounded pride. The recognition crystallized Sarah's thoughts, clearing away uncertainty and fear. She had run once before, fled into wilderness with her children, hidden in a cave, waited passively for rescue. That decision had saved their lives. But now, with Rebecca captive, with James exposed, with Jenkins's fate unknown, running would mean abandoning those who had risked everything to protect her. With swift, decisive movements, Sarah secured the twins in their carrier, whispering soothing words as she checked that Thomas's revolver was loaded and accessible at her waist. Then she guided her horse carefully down the slope, using the approach James had taught her: indirect, utilizing cover, minimizing visibility. As she drew closer to the homestead, voices became audible, Winters issuing sharp commands, a subordinate reporting that the property was otherwise empty. Rebecca's clear voice denying knowledge of Sarah's whereabouts with convincing indignation. Sarah tethered her horse in a protected thicket, lifting the twins from their carrier and settling them in a natural hollow formed by tree roots and soft earth. She covered them with her cloak, pressing a gentle finger to their lips in the universal signal for quiet. "Brave little ones," she whispered, "stay silent for Mama, like in the cave." Whether they understood or simply responded to her tone, both twins remained still and watchful as Sarah moved away, revolver now drawn, staying low, and using the techniques James had demonstrated during their days at the cabin. She caught glimpses of the unfolding situation through gaps in the underbrush. James positioned at the barn corner, Jenkins apparently captured and held by one of Winters's men near the well, Rebecca still on the porch with Winters and another guard. Two more armed men circled the property perimeter, searching outbuildings. Sarah calculated odds with grim clarity. 5 armed men against James, and possibly Jenkins, if he could be freed. Rebecca as hostage. The twins hidden but vulnerable if. The searching men expanded their perimeter. The decision formed with surprising certainty. Not a plan born of desperation or fear, but of clarity. The same clarity that had driven her from the burning wagons with her children clutched against her chest, that had led her to the cave sanctuary, that had guided her survival through those long, hungry days of waiting. She circled wide, staying beyond the searching men's pattern, making her way toward the back of the house, where a cellar entrance provided access Rebecca had once shown her in case of tornado or attack. If she could reach it unseen, she could enter the house, create disruption from within, perhaps provide James the opening he needed. The distance seemed immense, each step potentially disastrous if spotted. But Sarah moved with the patience of a woman who had already survived impossible odds, who had held hungry infants through endless night hours, who had learned that sometimes stillness was stronger than action. She reached the cellar doors without detection, easing one open just enough to slip inside, descending into cool darkness. The familiar sense of Rebecca's preserves and stored vegetables oriented her as she found the inner stairs, the door that led to the kitchen. From this position, she could hear Winter's voice clearly, his Boston accent incongruous against the frontier setting. "I grow tired of this charade, Mrs. Mitchell. Your sister-in-law and her bastard children have no rightful claim to Thomas Mitchell's estate. Tell me where they're hiding, and this unpleasantness ends." Rebecca's response came cold and controlled. "How dare you speak of legitimacy, Mr. Winters, when you orchestrated the murder of 15 families to steal what isn't yours? Thomas Mitchell's children are his rightful heirs, properly documented and witnessed. No amount of violence will change that fact." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for Rebecca's unwavering loyalty, despite their differences, despite the danger it now placed her in. She eased the kitchen door open a fraction, gaining visual confirmation of positions. Rebecca and Winters on the far side of the main room, the guard standing by the front windows. All attention focused outward where James presumably remained visible enough to hold their attention. The moment required perfect timing, coordination without communication. Sarah took a steadying breath, remembering James's lessons about creating diversion, about using expectation against an opponent. She raised Thomas's revolver, aimed at the ceiling beam above the guard, and fired. The sharp crack brought instant chaos. The guard ducking reflexively, Winters shouting commands. Rebecca seizing the moment to drive an elbow into her captor's ribs with unexpected strength. From outside came answering shots, James taking advantage of the confusion to engage the men in the yard. Sarah burst from the kitchen, revolver now aimed steadily at Winters, who recovered quickly, spinning to face this new threat with cold calculation. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell," he said, voice slick with false cordiality despite the circumstances. "How convenient that you've saved me the trouble of hunting you further." "Step away from my sister," Sarah commanded, using Rebecca's distraction to put herself between Winters and the older woman. Winters smiled thinly. "You've developed frontier boldness, I see." A far cry from the demure Boston widow who refused my generous proposal. "I saw your true nature then," Sarah replied, keeping the revolver absolutely steady. "I simply lacked words for it. Now I know exactly what you are, a coward who hired others to kill women and children rather than face the law's judgment." His expression hardened. The law would have tied Thomas's estate in litigation for years. Your children might have been grown before seeing a penny. I offered a practical solution: security, position, immediate access to what was rightfully Thomas's. "Nothing was rightful about murdering 15 families, Sarah countered, hearing distant gunfire that suggested James was engaging the outside guards. "Nothing justified orphaning children, widowing women, destroying lives for mere property." Winters's hand moved subtly toward his jacket, where a weapon undoubtedly waited. "Yet here you stand, weapon raised, threatening the same. How quickly. The wilderness corrupts Eastern sensibilities." "The wilderness taught me to distinguish between survival and murder," Sarah replied, recognizing his diversionary tactic. "Don't move your hand further, Mr. Winters. Unlike you, I don't need hired guns to protect what's mine." The standoff might have continued, but the front door burst open, James entering in a controlled rush, rifle at the ready, blood streaking one sleeve, but his aim unwavering. Behind him, Jenkins appeared, having apparently freed himself in the confusion. "It's over, Winters," James announced, voice deadly calm. "Your men are down or fled. Colonel's forces approaching from the south. Surrender now." Winters assessed his options with the calculating precision of a businessman cutting losses. His gaze swept from James to Sarah to Rebecca, measuring threat against opportunity. "Perhaps this round," he conceded, raising his hands with exaggerated compliance. "But Boston courts favor Boston businessmen, Mrs. Mitchell. Even with documented heirs, a widow's claim remains contestable, especially when her moral character comes into question." His gaze flicked meaningfully toward James. The implication clear: that association with a half-Cherokee tracker, isolation in a mountain cabin, would be twisted into scandal that undermined her standing in any Eastern court. To everyone's surprise, it was Rebecca who responded, stepping forward with the rigid dignity that characterized her at her most formal. "Mr. Winters," she said coldly, "you mistake the nature of this territory and its people. The Mitchell name stands for honor, integrity, and perseverance against all hardship. My sister-in-law and her children exemplify those qualities. As witness to their character, as executor of my late husband's will, and as legal guardian named in their father's testament, I assure you that no Boston court will find fault with their claim or their conduct." Sarah turned to Rebecca in astonishment, having never heard of such provisions in Thomas's will. Rebecca met her gaze with subtle confirmation. "The papers were among those recovered from the wagon train. I took the liberty of examining them while you were away. James Mitchell named his brother Thomas as executor should he die first. Thomas in turn named me. The chain of stewardship is unbroken. The unexpected alliance, Rebecca's social standing and legal authority combined with Sarah's first-hand testimony and the twins' documented legitimacy visibly deflated Winters's confidence. For the first time, calculation gave way to genuine uncertainty in his expression. As if to emphasize the shifting balance of power, the sound of approaching horses signaled the colonel's forces arriving. Jenkins moved to secure Winters, relieving him of the concealed weapon from his jacket with professional efficiency. "Take him out," James directed, maintaining his position until Jenkins had removed the prisoner from the house. Only then did he lower his rifle, turning his attention to the women. "Are you hurt?" Rebecca shook her head, her composure remarkable given the ordeal. "They arrived an hour ago, claimed to be lost travelers seeking directions. I suspected something was wrong when they asked specifically about Sarah and the twins." "You did?" "Well," James assured her, then looked to Sarah. "The twins? Hidden near where I left the horse," Sarah replied, already moving toward the door. "They're safe, I'm sure of it, but they'll be frightened." Together they hurried to the hiding place, finding the twins exactly as Sarah had left them, wide-eyed, but silent, responding to danger as they had in the cave, with an instinctive stillness that tugged at Sarah's heart. "My brave ones," she murmured, gathering them close, feeling their small bodies relax at her familiar touch. She turned to find both James and Rebecca watching, him with quiet pride, her with newfound respect. "You've changed," Rebecca observed, softly. "Both you and the children. The territory has marked you." "For the better, I hope," Sarah replied, rising with a twin in each arm. Rebecca's expression softened uncharacteristically. "I believe so, though it challenges many of my certainties about proper ways and proper places." The acknowledgement, simple but profound from a woman of Rebecca's rigid convictions, felt like acceptance of all that had transpired. The unlikely alliance with James, the wilderness lessons that had shaped Sarah's responses, the blurring of social boundaries in the face of genuine threat. As they walked back toward the homestead, now secured by the colonel's men, Sarah found herself between these two contrasting figures. Rebecca with her biblical certainties and Eastern proprieties, James with his wilderness wisdom and quiet strength. Different worlds, different values, yet both had risked everything to protect her children, to secure their rightful place in this harsh, beautiful territory. "Will you stay?" James asked quietly, the question directed at Sarah, but inclusive of the twins in her arms. Now that Winters is captured, now that the danger is past. The question carried layers beyond its simple wording, about belonging, about choice, about the future she envisioned for her children. Sarah looked from Rebecca's homestead to the wilderness beyond, feeling the tension between civilized boundaries and untamed possibility. "Yes," she answered finally, certainty settling in her chest, like a breath held too long finally released. "This is where we belong now, where they belong." She glanced down at Emma and Ethan, their faces turned toward the open sky with instinctive yearning. "The territory has marked us, as Rebecca says. For better or worse, it's home." The simple declaration seemed to satisfy both her companions, Rebecca with her nod of approval at family obligation honored, James with his subtle smile of understanding at a choice freely made. Different responses from different worlds, yet both acknowledging the truth in Sarah's decision. As they reached the homestead yard, Colonel Hayes approached, tipping his hat respectfully. Mrs. Mitchell, Walker, Winters is secured, his surviving men as well. They'll stand trial for the massacre and for the attack on my patrol." "Thank you, Colonel," Sarah replied, shifting the twins to a more comfortable position. "For everything," Your protection, your belief in our story when others might have dismissed it. Hayes nodded gravely. Territory needs families like yours. People willing to endure hardship, to build something lasting. His gaze included all three adults in this assessment. Rebecca with her steadfast perseverance, Sarah with her protective courage, James with his invaluable skills. We'll be moving out shortly, Hayes continued, leaving 2 men as precaution until we're certain no other threats remain. But I believe your ordeal is over, Mrs. Mitchell. You and your children can begin building that life you journeyed so far to find. As the colonel moved away to supervise his men, Sarah found herself at a crossroads of sorts, Rebecca waiting by the house that represented structure and security, James lingering by the edge of wilderness that had both threatened and saved them. 2 paths, 2 possibilities, 2 futures for children born to one world, but clearly thriving in another. But as Emma reached impulsively toward James, tiny fingers grasping at the air between them, Sarah recognized that the choice wasn't between paths, but between limitations, between accepting boundaries others created or defining her own. The wilderness had taught her survival at any cost. The settlement had taught her the value of community and stability. Both lessons mattered. Both would shape the future she built for her twins in this territory that demanded both strength and tenderness, both independence and connection. "Come inside," she said, including both Rebecca and James in the invitation. "We all have healing to do, plans to make, and these little ones need to be home at last." The simple words bridged worlds that protocol would have kept separate. Rebecca's domain of domestic order, James's realm of wilderness knowledge, a beginning rather than an ending, a circle completing rather than a line drawn. And as they entered the homestead together, the widow, the tracker, the twins who had survived against impossible odds, Sarah felt the territory's final lesson settling into her bones. That true security came not from walls or weapons or social standing, but from the courage to recognize genuine allies, regardless of where they stood in the world's rigid hierarchies. For Emma and Ethan, heirs to both worlds, that lesson might prove the most valuable inheritance of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.